At our 5th anniversary dinner, my husband stood with his wealthy friends holding divorce papers. To his new queen, they cheered as he wrapped an arm around his mistress. I quietly signed the papers, thanked them, and then did something that left the entire Michelin-starred restaurant in stunned silence. My name is Stella, and I am 33 years old. I always knew my husband and his family looked down on me, but I never expected them to turn my anniversary into a public execution. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who underestimated your true worth. Let us set the scene. We were at one of the most exclusive and expensive restaurants in downtown Chicago. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the white linen tablecloths, and soft jazz played in the background. It was supposed to be an intimate celebration of my 5 years of marriage to Preston. Preston was 35, a senior director at a top-tier venture capital firm, and a man who firmly believed the entire world revolved around his tailored Italian suits and his impressive bank account. Instead of booking a romantic table for two, he had invited his parents Richard and Brenda, along with a dozen of his loud, arrogant finance buddies. I sat at the far end of the long dining table, nursing my sparkling water, already feeling like a complete outsider in my own life. Brenda sat directly across from me, her heavy diamond jewelry clinking every time she picked at her expensive salad. She never missed a single opportunity to remind me of my place in their social hierarchy. Just last week, she had loudly told her country club friends that I was nothing but a boring forensic accountant who dragged down her son's vibrant lifestyle. They constantly threw my childhood in the foster care system in my face, treating my lack of a wealthy pedigree as some sort of contagious disease. I endured their snide remarks and endless microaggressions because I truly believed Preston and I were building a solid life together. I was horribly wrong. Halfway through the main course, Preston abruptly stood up and tapped his crystal wine glass with a silver spoon. The sharp clinking sound cut through the elegant hum of the dining room. His friends immediately fell silent, grins spreading across their faces, like they were all in on a massive joke I had not heard. I looked up expecting a generic toast to our milestone anniversary. Instead, Preston reached his hand out toward a small table just behind ours. A young woman stood up and confidently walked over to him. It was Lexi, his 24-year-old assistant. She was wearing a skin-tight red silk dress that left very little to the imagination, her blonde hair perfectly styled to cascade over her shoulders. Preston pulled Lexi close, wrapping a possessive arm tightly around her waist. He raised his glass high in the air. "I want to propose a toast," he announced, his voice booming so loudly that diners at other tables actually turned to stare at us. Not to the past 5 years of absolute boredom, but to my future, to my new queen. His friends erupted into loud cheers and applause, whistling and raising their drinks. Richard and Brenda actually raised their wine glasses too, smiling approvingly at the young girl in the red dress. Preston reached into his tailored jacket, pulled out a thick, folded document, and tossed it onto the table, right on top of my dinner plate. The heavy paper landed with a thud, knocking over my water glass. "The divorce papers are already drawn up, Stella," he said, his tone dripping with absolute contempt. "Sign them. Do not waste everyone's time. You do not belong in my world, and you never did." His buddy across the table snickered loudly. "What did you expect, Preston? You married a human calculator. She probably crunches numbers in her sleep." Brenda leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with pure malice. "Do not make a scene, Stella. Just take the hint and leave. You should be grateful my son gave you 5 years of luxury. A girl from an orphanage could never fit in with a family of our status anyway." Lexi giggled, leaning her head on Preston's shoulder. "I told you she would be too stunned to speak, babe. Look at her face." They expected tears. They expected me to scream, to throw my drink in his face, to beg him to reconsider, or to run out of the restaurant, hiding my face in sheer humiliation. But I did not shed a single tear. My heart beat at a slow, steady rhythm. I looked at Preston, really looked at him and saw exactly what he was: a fragile, arrogant man who needed a public spectacle to feel powerful. I calmly picked up my linen napkin and dabbed the corners of my mouth. I picked up the heavy legal document, flipped directly to the last page, and pulled a sleek metal pen from my clutch. The entire table watched me in dead silence, the cruel laughter dying down, as my complete lack of emotion deeply unsettled them. I signed my name on the dotted line with smooth, deliberate strokes. I pushed the papers back across the table toward Preston. "Thank you," I said, my voice perfectly clear and carrying no trace of sorrow. "You just saved me $500 an hour in lawyer fees. I was planning to serve you on Monday, but this is much more efficient." Preston frowned, his smug expression faltering for a fraction of a second. Before he could process what my words actually meant, I signaled the waiter who had been hovering nervously nearby. "Check, please, just for my portion," I said. The waiter hurried over with the leather folder. I opened my clutch and pulled out a solid black titanium credit card. I placed it quietly on the silver tray. Brenda's eyes widened drastically. She recognized that specific card. It was an exclusive tier available only to clients with 8-figure bank balances, something Preston's venture capital firm required years of networking to even look at. "You can pay for your new queen yourself," I told Preston, standing up and grabbing my coat. "Enjoy the champagne." I tipped the waiter generously, turned on my heel, and walked away. I walked through the opulent dining room with my head held high, the sharp click of my heels echoing on the polished marble floor. I did not look back once. I knew Preston was sitting there sneering, probably telling his friends I was just putting on a brave face and trying to play it cool with a fake credit card. He truly thought he had completely destroyed me. He had absolutely no idea who he had just crossed. I reached the valet stand outside and handed over my ticket. The crisp Chicago night air felt like absolute freedom. But before my car could pull up, the heavy restaurant doors burst open behind me. It was Brenda. She marched down the steps toward the parking lot, her face twisted in rage, ready to deliver her final blow. The valet pulled my sedan up to the curb, leaving the engine running. A blast of freezing Chicago wind whipped through my coat, but the chill was nothing compared to the ice in my veins. I reached for the door handle, ready to drive away from 5 years of toxic manipulation, when high heels clicked aggressively against the concrete behind me. "Stella, do not take another step." I turned slowly. Brenda marched down the restaurant steps, her expensive fur coat pulled tight across her chest, her face flushed with wine and rage. The polite, condescending mask she wore inside the dining room had completely vanished. Out here in the dimly lit parking lot, away from the prying eyes of her country club friends, her true nature surfaced. She positioned herself directly between me and my car door, crossing her arms. "You think you are so clever with that little stunt in there?" She spat, her voice echoing off the brick walls of the valet station, throwing down a credit card and walking out. "Let me make one thing crystal clear to you right now. You are packing your bags tonight. I want you out of that suburban mansion before my son brings Lexi home." I looked at her, tilting my head slightly. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. "Excuse me." "You heard me." Brenda took a step closer, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "Preston bought that house. He worked 80 hours a week at the venture capital firm to pay for that luxury while you sat at a desk staring at spreadsheets. You do not get to live in a multi-million-dollar property paid for by my son. Do not even think about trying to claim it in the divorce settlement. You came into this family with nothing, and you are leaving with nothing. Do not try to cling to our wealth." I let her finish her rant. I watched the triumphant gleam in her eyes, fueled by years of looking down on me because I grew up in the foster care system. She truly believed I was a charity case they had taken in. She believed Preston was the financial titan holding our lives together. I let out a soft, genuine laugh. It was not a bitter laugh, but one of pure, unadulterated amusement. The sound seemed to infuriate her even more. "What is so funny?" she demanded, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. I stepped around her, sliding into the driver's seat. The engine purred softly. I pressed the button to roll down the window, resting my arm on the smooth leather frame. I looked up at my mother-in-law, making sure my eyes locked dead onto hers. "Brenda," I said, my tone as calm as a frozen lake. "Did you forget what happened 5 years ago, right before the wedding?" She frowned, confused by the sudden shift. "What are you talking about?" "Preston wanted to buy that gorgeous suburban estate to impress you and Richard," I reminded her smoothly. "But when he applied for the mortgage, the bank laughed in his face. Do you remember why? Because your brilliant, successful son had tanked his credit score. He had leveraged himself to the breaking point, trying to keep up appearances with his finance buddies. He was swimming in hidden debt. The bank denied his loan instantly." Brenda opened her mouth to argue, but the color was already starting to drain from her cheeks. The reality of that memory was hitting her. She had conveniently blocked out that embarrassing chapter. So I continued enunciating every single word carefully. "I bought the house. Me. The boring forensic accountant. But I did not just sign a standard mortgage. That house is owned entirely by a private trust. A trust that is solely in my name. Preston never owned a single brick of that property. He is not the homeowner. He is just a tenant." "You are lying," Brenda hissed, gripping her expensive handbag so tightly her knuckles turned white. "My son pays the mortgage every month," he told me. I smiled, shaking my head. "Preston pays rent to my trust. It is a standard lease agreement. He pays the monthly fee, and the trust covers the property taxes and maintenance. I set it up that way to protect my assets from his reckless spending habits. And it turns out, that was the smartest financial decision I ever made." The silence that followed was absolute. The cold wind howled around us, but Brenda stood frozen, her mouth slightly open. The illusion of her son's supreme dominance was shattering right in front of her eyes. The power dynamic she had relied on for 5 years was completely inverted. Therefore, I stated, leaning slightly closer to the window, "I am not moving anywhere tonight." Preston, however, has fundamentally breached his lease agreement. Since he was so eager to serve me divorce papers publicly, he essentially served his own eviction notice. His deadline to get his designer suits and his little mistress out of my property is exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. After that, the security system codes will be changed, and anything left inside will be donated to charity. Brenda stared at me, her chest heaving. The realization that I held the keys, the deed, and all the power finally registered in her mind. Her golden child was about to be homeless, and the daughter-in-law she had treated like dirt was the one pulling the strings. The sheer humiliation of it broke something inside her. "You ungrateful little witch!" she screamed. All pretense of high society manners vanished in an instant. Brenda lunged forward with surprising speed, thrusting her hand through the open car window. She aimed a vicious, open-palmed slap directly at my face, her rings flashing dangerously under the streetlights. I did not even have time to flinch or raise my arms to block the incoming physical blow. But the violent strike never landed. Just inches from my cheek, a large, powerful hand clamped down onto Brenda's wrist like a steel vise. The sudden immense force stopped her completely in her tracks, jerking her backward. She gasped loudly in pure shock, struggling frantically to pull her arm free, but the iron grip holding her was entirely immovable. I looked past her trembling shoulder to see exactly who had stepped out of the deep shadows of the restaurant parking lot. The yellow glow of the overhead lamp illuminated the tense scene. I watched Brenda's face twist from pure, unfiltered aggression to absolute, unadulterated shock. She tugged at her wrist again, her heavy diamond bracelets catching the light and clinking together, but the hand holding her remained rock steady. The person standing directly behind her had materialized so silently, I had not even heard the heavy footsteps approaching my vehicle. This was not the valet rushing over. This was not a random bystander stepping in to be a late-night hero. This was someone who had been watching the entire hostile exchange unfold from the dark periphery of the lot. Someone who knew exactly how vicious my husband's family could be behind closed doors when they thought nobody else was looking. Someone who, just like me, had silently endured years of their thinly veiled insults, racial microaggressions, and blatantly condescending behavior at every single Thanksgiving dinner and summer barbecue. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the sharp adrenaline slowly leveling out in my bloodstream. The sudden shift in the atmosphere was incredibly palpable. The predator had just realized with absolute terror that she was definitely not at the top of the food chain tonight. Brenda let out a sharp, indignant noise. "Let go of me this instant," she demanded, her voice shaking uncontrollably with a volatile mixture of elite outrage and sudden, genuine fear. "Do you have any idea who I am?" A deep, resonant voice echoed in the freezing air, remaining remarkably calm, but carrying an undeniable heavy weight of authority. "I know exactly who you are, Brenda, and I highly suggest you step away from this car." My eyes widened slightly as the tall, broad-shouldered man released her wrist and stepped fully into the harsh light. The figure moved fully into the pool of yellow streetlight, illuminating the icy pavement. It was Terrence. He was 36 years old, an aggressively sharp corporate attorney and the husband of Preston's older sister. Being married into this family had never granted Terrence any actual respect from them. As a brilliant black man who built his career entirely from scratch without the aid of generational wealth or Ivy League legacy admissions, he was constantly subjected to Richard and Brenda's passive-aggressive snubs. They smiled at him in public, but behind closed doors they treated his presence at their country club dinners like a charitable tax write-off. Brenda yanked her arm back, rubbing her wrist as if his touch had physically burned her. "Terrence, what on earth is wrong with you?" she demanded, her voice trembling with indignation. "You dare lay a hand on me? I am trying to handle a private family matter. This gold digger is trying to steal Preston's house." Terrence did not raise his voice. He simply adjusted his tailored overcoat against the biting Chicago wind and looked down at her with a gaze so intensely cold it could freeze boiling water. "Brenda, you are currently attempting to assault a woman in a valet parking lot directly under two high-definition security cameras," Terrence stated, his tone carrying the precise, intimidating cadence of a seasoned litigator. "The police response time in this financial district is less than 4 minutes. If Stella presses charges for attempted battery, your socialite friends at the country club will have an absolute field day with your mugshot before the morning news even airs." Brenda's jaw snapped shut instantly. She glanced nervously upward, spotting the blinking red light of the surveillance camera mounted on the brick wall of the restaurant. "Go back inside the dining room." Terrence continued, his voice leaving absolutely no room for argument or negotiation. "Go drink your expensive wine and celebrate your son's spectacular mistakes. The parking lot is no place for you." Brenda glared at him, her chest heaving with humiliated fury. She looked like she wanted to scream, but the pure legal threat had effectively paralyzed her. She shot me one last venomous glare, pulled her heavy fur coat tighter around her shoulders, and spun around. Her heels clicked frantically against the pavement as she fled back up the restaurant stairs, desperate to escape the consequences of her own unhinged behavior. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind her, leaving Terrence and me entirely alone in the freezing parking lot. The sudden silence was heavy, punctuated only by the low hum of my car engine and the distant wail of a city siren. Terrence let out a slow, exhausted breath. He reached inside his inner coat pocket, pulled out a thick cigar, and clamped it between his teeth. He produced a sleek silver lighter, the flame briefly illuminating his sharp jawline and the deep lines of fatigue around his eyes. He took a long drag, blowing a plume of thick white smoke into the icy wind. "I always knew they were delusional," he said quietly, leaning his broad frame against the concrete pillar next to my car. "But cheering for a mistress while serving divorce papers over a Michelin star dinner, that takes a special kind of arrogant stupidity." I offered him a grim, acknowledging smile. "They genuinely believe they are completely untouchable. They think their bank accounts shield them from basic human decency." Terrence chuckled, a dark, humorless sound that drifted away in the wind. "They think a lot of things. They think I am just the diversity hire their daughter brought home to ruin their perfect family portrait. They think you are just an ungrateful orphan who hit the jackpot by marrying their golden boy." He turned his head, locking his intense, observant gaze with mine. But we both know the truth, do we not, Stella? We are the only two people in that entire family who actually know how to read a balance sheet without lying to ourselves. I nodded slowly, feeling a profound sense of solidarity. For 5 long years, Terence and I had exchanged those silent, knowing looks across holiday dinner tables, while Richard pontificated about his brilliant investments, and Preston bragged about his massive returns. We were the ultimate outcasts, the ones who had to work 10 times harder just to be allowed in the room, only to be treated like the help once we got there. Terence reached into his other pocket. He held his closed fist out toward my open car window. "Hold out your hand," he instructed softly. I extended my palm. He dropped a small encrypted titanium USB drive into my hand. The metal was freezing to the touch. "What is this?" I asked, staring at the small silver device. "Preston thinks he is the absolute smartest guy in the entire venture capital fund," Terence explained, taking another slow drag of his cigar. "He struts around the office acting like he is the Wolf of Wall Street. He thinks because he brings in loud, flashy clients, nobody bothers to look at the boring paperwork. But he forgot one crucial detail. I head the internal legal and compliance division for the parent company. My entire job is looking at the boring paperwork." I gripped the USB tightly, my forensic accountant instincts instantly flaring to life. "What exactly did you find?" Terence smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression that promised absolute ruin. "In that drive are the complete, unedited records of Preston's irregular money transfers over the past 8 months. I am talking about shell companies, offshore routing, and blatant misappropriation of funds. He has been skimming off the top of his own clients to fund his luxury lifestyle and his shiny new 24-year-old assistant. Consider it my divorce gift to you." I looked from the drive up to Terence. Providing me with this highly confidential data was a massive professional risk on his part. If Preston went down, the fallout could hit the entire firm. "Why give this to me?" I asked. "Because I am tired of watching them step on the people who actually do the hard work," Terence said firmly. "And because I know you have the exact skill set required to completely bury him." I reached my hand out of the car window. Terence took it, wrapping his large hand around mine in a firm, resolute handshake. Two outcasts sealing a silent pact to bring down the house of cards. "Happy anniversary," Stella, Terence said. He released my hand, turned his collar up against the wind, and walked away into the dark parking lot, disappearing into the shadows. I sat in the driver's seat, my heart pounding a fierce, relentless rhythm against my ribs. I immediately rolled up the window, sealing out the freezing air and the ambient noise of the city. The interior of the car was completely silent. I reached into my passenger seat, grabbed my leather briefcase, and pulled out my high-performance laptop. I balanced the computer on my steering wheel, the screen illuminating the dark cabin with a harsh, bright light. I flipped open the protective cover of the titanium USB drive and inserted it into the port. A password prompt instantly flashed across the screen. I typed in the encryption key Terence had discreetly etched onto the back of the metal casing. The decryption process took less than 30 seconds. A series of heavily secured folders popped open. I clicked on the main directory, my eyes rapidly scanning the rows and columns of the master spreadsheet. My breath hitched in my throat. As a forensic accountant, I had spent my entire career tracking hidden assets and uncovering corporate fraud. I knew exactly what money laundering and embezzlement looked like, but seeing it executed this recklessly, this arrogantly, was staggering. The screen displayed a massive network of fraudulent transactions. Preston had not just been skimming a few $1,000s here and there. He was actively diverting massive sums of capital directly from his most important client portfolios. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were being systematically funneled into a dummy corporation registered in Delaware. I clicked on the disbursement logs for that specific shell company. The expenses read like a shopping list for a newly minted millionaire. Massive down payments on luxury real estate. Wire transfers to exotic car dealerships. exorbitant charges at high-end designer boutiques. Preston was not just cheating on me. He was actively stealing millions from his trusting investors to finance the grand illusion of his supreme wealth and to buy the absolute loyalty of his new mistress. He was committing massive, undeniable federal crimes. I stared at the glowing numbers, a cold, calculating smile slowly spreading across my face. Preston thought he was kicking me out into the cold with nothing. He had absolutely no idea that I now held the exact weapon required to completely incinerate his entire existence. The morning sun barely pierced through the heavy tinted windows of my private, secure server room. This was not the tiny cubicle at the mid-level accounting firm where I played the role of a quiet employee. This was my actual domain. 3 massive curved monitors glowed brightly in the dim light, displaying streams of encrypted data. I sat in my ergonomic leather chair sipping black coffee when my personal cell phone began vibrating violently across the mahogany desk. A flood of notifications swarmed my lock screen. Direct messages from mutual acquaintances, missed calls from concerned colleagues, and countless tags on a viral social media post. I picked up the device and clicked on the most prominent notification. The screen immediately filled with the high-pitched, arrogant laughter of my husband's 24-year-old mistress. Lexi was recording a selfie video, her perfectly manicured hand holding up a set of gleaming silver keys. Behind her, the unmistakable floor-to-ceiling windows of a premium Chicago penthouse offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline. The camera quickly panned down to the street level, zooming in on a brand-new cherry-red Porsche Carrera parked conspicuously in the VIP loading zone. Lexi flipped the camera back to her face, pouting her lips for the lens. When your man upgrades his entire life and treats you like the absolute royalty you are, Lexi squealed into the microphone. Out with the boring, broke foster care trash, and in with the luxury. Some girls are just born to ride in the passenger seat of a Porsche, while others belong on the bus. Thank you for the penthouse, baby. The caption below the video was a direct, vicious strike aimed right at my throat. It read, "Upgrading from a 0 to 100, bye-bye boring ex-wife." The comments section was an absolute cesspool of internet toxicity. Preston's finance buddies and Lexi's superficial followers were tearing me apart. They called me a pathetic gold digger who finally got tossed to the curb. They mocked my clothes, my career, and my background. It was a digital public execution designed to humiliate me into total submission. They wanted me to break down, delete my accounts, and disappear into the shadows. I did not shed a single tear. I did not type a furious reply or block her account. I simply placed the phone back onto the desk and turned my attention to the glowing monitors in front of me. Social media was nothing but a fragile illusion built on desperate vanity. I preferred cold, hard mathematics. I plugged the titanium USB drive Terrence had given me the previous night into my primary decryption terminal. The massive spreadsheet of Preston's illicit financial network filled my center screen. I cracked my knuckles and began to work, letting my forensic accounting instincts take complete control of my mind. I pulled up the public listing for the exact penthouse Lexi was flaunting. It was a premium unit in the Gold Coast district, a property that required a massive upfront security deposit and a prepaid annual lease. I ran the address through a proprietary database I had built for Aegis Shield, bypassing the standard public records. The lease had been signed exactly 2 days ago. The total upfront cost was a staggering $250,000. Next, I pulled the vehicle identification number for a red Porsche Carrera, registered in the state of Illinois within the last 48 hours. The purchase price, fully loaded and paid in cash, was exactly $185,400. I turned back to the spreadsheet containing Preston's shell company disbursements. I ran a targeted search query for those specific dates. The results populated instantly. My eyes narrowed as I stared at the digital ledger. On Tuesday afternoon, exactly 48 hours ago, Preston had authorized 2 massive wire transfers from a dummy corporation registered in Delaware. The first transfer was for $250,000. The second transfer was for $185,400. The numbers matched down to the absolute final cent. He had not used his own venture capital bonus. He had not used his personal savings. He had used the shell company to finance his mistress's lavish lifestyle. But as a forensic expert, I knew that tracking the disbursement was only half the battle. I needed to trace the money all the way back to its original source. I initiated a reverse trace algorithm on the Delaware Shell Company, cutting through layers of obfuscation and fake vendor invoices. The progress bar loaded steadily until the true origin account flashed onto my screen in bright red text. My blood ran completely cold. The breath caught in my throat as the sheer depravity of my husband's actions truly registered. The funds had not been skimmed from the venture capital firm's general operating budget. They had not been taken from a billionaire client who would never miss the money. Preston had actively targeted and drained a specific highly vulnerable account. He had embezzled over $400,000 directly from the Union Workers' Retirement Fund. He was stealing the life savings of hard-working blue-collar pensioners, people who had broken their backs for 40 years just to secure a modest retirement. Preston was wiping out their futures so he could buy a sports car and a luxury skybox for a 24-year-old girl who mocked people on the internet. A fierce, unyielding anger ignited in my chest. This was no longer just a messy divorce. This was a massive federal crime, and Preston was carelessly leaving a trail of breadcrumbs right to his own front door. I rapidly began downloading the transaction logs, compiling a pristine chain of evidence that any federal prosecutor would absolutely dream of having. I pinged the routing numbers, verifying the exact digital signatures Preston had used to bypass his firm's internal compliance checks. But in my relentless pursuit of the data, I triggered a silent tripwire. Preston was arrogant, but his firm employed aggressive automated security software. The moment my secure terminal queried the specific routing node associated with the Union Workers' Retirement Fund, an automated alert flashed through the venture capital firm's network. Miles away in his luxury office, Preston's personal phone buzzed with an urgent security notification. Someone was actively probing the exact dummy accounts he had used to buy Lexi's gifts. The trace originated from an IP address associated with my mid-level accounting firm. Panic immediately set in. Preston realized his discarded, supposedly boring wife was actually looking into his untouchable finances. He knew if I found even a single discrepancy, his entire glamorous life would collapse into a federal prison sentence. Fear morphed into vicious desperation. Preston decided he had to crush me instantly before I could dig any deeper. He picked up his office phone, his hands shaking with rage, and dialed the direct private line of the senior managing partner at my accounting firm. He was going to use every ounce of his VIP client leverage to have me fired, discredited, and thrown out onto the street by the end of the hour. My phone buzzed violently against the mahogany desk, vibrating with a notification that shattered the quiet hum of the secure server room. It was a direct text message from Preston. The preview on the illuminated screen displayed a frantic, aggressive tone that completely contradicted his usual polished venture capitalist persona. I tapped the glass to open the full message and read the desperate threat he had just sent me. "You are finished. Do not mess with me. I know exactly what you are trying to do, and I just made a single phone call that will ensure you never work in this city again. Pack up your cheap desk. You are done." A cold, analytical calm washed over me as I read the words. Preston had panicked. His automated security tripwire had alerted him to my data extraction, and in his arrogant desperation, he had deployed his only perceived weapon. He had called my employer. As the wife of a high-profile executive, I had intentionally taken a mid-level forensic accounting position at a highly respected but rigidly traditional firm in downtown Chicago. Preston viewed my firm as a subservient entity to his massive financial networks. He believed a single complaint from a VIP client like him would be enough to destroy my career instantly. He had likely fabricated a vicious story about me stealing confidential data or breaching client trust. Right on cue, my desk phone began to ring loudly. The caller ID flashed the extension for the managing director. His name was Gregory, a man who worshipped wealthy clients and feared venture capitalists like Preston more than anything else in the corporate world. "Stella, my office right now." Gregory sounded breathless and incredibly angry through the speaker. I did not rush. I took a slow sip of my black coffee, neatly closed my laptop, and locked the encrypted titanium USB drive securely inside my blazer pocket. I smoothed the wrinkles from my tailored charcoal suit, adjusted my posture, and walked out of the secure server room. The bustling bullpen of the accounting firm fell entirely silent as I passed. Colleagues stared at me with wide eyes, clearly having caught wind of the sudden explosive phone call from an angry billionaire. I kept my chin high, my heels clicking a steady, unbothered rhythm against the polished hardwood floor. I opened the heavy oak door to Gregory's corner office without bothering to knock. Gregory was pacing frantically behind his massive glass desk, his face flushed red, holding a freshly printed email. "Close the door, Stella," he demanded, pointing a trembling finger directly at my chest. "I just got off the phone with your husband. He is threatening to pull his firm's entire auditing contract, a contract worth millions, because he claims you are actively stealing proprietary financial data from his secure servers using our network. He says you are conducting unauthorized corporate espionage and trying to sabotage his investments out of spite." I stood perfectly still in the center of the room, my hands resting casually in my pockets. "He is lying to cover his own tracks, Gregory. He is currently embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from the Union Workers' Retirement Fund to buy luxury real estate for a 24-year-old assistant." Gregory's eyes widened in sheer horror, but his absolute subservience to wealth immediately overpowered his moral compass. "I do not care about his personal drama or his spending habits. I care about this firm. Preston is a titan in this city. If he says you are a liability, you are a liability. He demanded your immediate termination and threatened to report you to the ethics board to have your accounting license permanently revoked. I am sorry, Stella, but I cannot risk the firm's reputation over a bitter divorce dispute. You are fired. We need your security badge and your company laptop right now." Gregory braced himself, gripping the edge of his desk, clearly expecting me to cry, to beg for my job, or to frantically defend my innocence. Instead, I reached into my pocket, unclipped my plastic employee identification badge, and tossed it carelessly onto his pristine glass desk. The plastic clattered loudly against the hard surface, breaking the heavy tension in the room. "There is absolutely no need to fire me, Gregory," I said, my voice dripping with absolute icy authority. "Because I quit." Gregory stared at the badge, completely, utterly bewildered by my total lack of panic. "You quit? You are facing complete industry blacklisting. Your entire livelihood is gone." I offered him a sharp, predatory smile. "I do not need this job. I never actually needed this job. I only worked here for the past 3 years to study market security vulnerabilities. Your firm handles the auditing for some of the most corrupt hedge funds in Chicago. I needed a front-row seat to observe the exact compliance loopholes that men like Preston exploit every single day. You provided me with excellent research data, Gregory. Tell Preston he can keep his miserable auditing contract." I turned my back on my former boss and walked out of the office. I did not stop at my desk. I did not pack up any meaningless personal trinkets or office supplies. I simply walked straight out of the glass double doors of the firm and stepped onto the busy Chicago sidewalk. The freezing wind whipped my hair around my face, but I felt a burning, exhilarating heat radiating from my chest. Preston thought he had just stripped me of my livelihood, my reputation, and my only source of income. He thought he had reduced me to a helpless, destitute orphan begging on the street. He had absolutely no idea that he had just untethered a sleeping dragon. I pulled my personal, heavily encrypted cell phone from my pocket. I bypassed the standard contacts list and dialed a highly secure private number that routed directly to a fortified command center in Silicon Valley. The line connected after a single muted ring. A crisp, professional voice answered immediately. "Secure line active. Awaiting your command." It was my lead operations director, a man who managed the daily logistics of my true empire. Activate my founder status at Aegis Shield. I ordered, my voice ringing with absolute clarity and undeniable power. Lift the corporate veil protocols. Initiate the executive transition procedures immediately. The game begins today. Understood. Madam Chairman? The voice replied, perfectly calm and incredibly efficient. Welcome back to the war room. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The disguise of the quiet, boring mid-level accountant was officially dead and buried. I was no longer Stella, the compliant wife. I was the anonymous founder of the most ruthless cybersecurity and data auditing corporation in North America, a company valued in the hundreds of millions. And I was about to turn my full devastating arsenal directly onto my arrogant husband. Meanwhile, across the city in his luxurious high-rise venture capital office, Preston was currently celebrating his supposed triumph. He genuinely believed his angry phone call had completely destroyed my entire existence. In his severely inflated ego, he assumed I was currently sitting on a curb, crying over my lost paycheck and my ruined reputation. He thought I was powerless, penniless, and thoroughly defeated. Fueling his own toxic narcissism, Preston decided that my absolute destruction was the perfect reason to throw a massive celebration. He wanted to show the entire elite social circle of Chicago that he had completely discarded me without a single scratch to his own armor. He wanted to flaunt his ill-gotten wealth and rub his new shiny toy directly in the face of polite society. Within hours of getting me fired, Preston and Lexi began sending out digital gold foil invitations to their newly formed network of superficial friends and wealthy enablers. They booked the grand ballroom of a five-star hotel overlooking the river. They ordered thousands of dollars in imported champagne and exotic floral arrangements. Preston and Lexi were throwing themselves a lavish, extravagant engagement party to loudly celebrate their stolen victory, completely unaware that the money funding their glamorous night was heavily monitored, and the woman they were laughing at was currently loading a financial sniper rifle aimed squarely at their heads. The venue they chose for their grotesque victory lap was the Obsidian Room, an ultra-exclusive steakhouse located right in the heart of the River North Gallery district. Preston had eagerly rented out the entire main dining floor to celebrate his hastily arranged engagement to Lexi. He desperately wanted to make a massive public spectacle of his newly acquired freedom. Towers of expensive champagne glasses formed glittering pyramids under the ambient lighting. Flash photographers continuously captured every single angle of Lexi parading around the room wearing a diamond necklace that definitely exceeded Preston's legitimate annual bonus. They were loudly toasting to their brilliant future, completely surrounded by a noisy crowd of superficial venture capitalists and eager social climbers who gladly ignored a violently destroyed marriage as long as the premium drinks were flowing for free. Preston truly believed he had successfully banished me to the shadows forever. He was absolutely convinced that I was currently sitting in a cheap suburban motel crying hysterically over my lost accounting job and my thoroughly ruined life. He had absolutely no idea that I was currently standing right next door. The Obsidian Room features a legendary private dining enclave known locally as the Vault. It sits slightly elevated above the main floor, completely encased in soundproof smoked glass that allows the VIP guests to look directly down on the regular patrons while remaining perfectly insulated from the noise. I had not booked the Vault to stalk my ex-husband. I had booked it 2 weeks ago to host an introductory dinner with 3 of the most influential tech billionaires in Silicon Valley. These brilliant men were the foundational investors who had secretly helped me build Aegis Shield. They flew into Chicago exclusively to meet the anonymous woman who had steadily generated a 400% return on their initial capital. I stepped into the vault, wearing a sharp, custom-tailored emerald green suit. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, unforgiving style. I wore absolutely no jewelry, letting my undeniable presence command the room. I took my seat at the head of the heavy oak table, engaging in high-level discussions about corporate cybersecurity acquisitions and global data auditing. My guests were intensely captivated by my strategic vision. We raised heavy glasses of aged Scotch, sealing massive financial agreements that would reshape the tech industry. Down on the main floor, the obnoxious cheering of Preston's engagement party filtered faintly through the thick glass walls. I ignored it completely, but Preston, heavily fueled by expensive bourbon and his own massive ego, happened to glance up toward the exclusive private room. Even through the dark smoked glass, he immediately recognized my profile. I watched his expression shift from arrogant joy to immediate furious confusion. He squinted hard, trying to comprehend exactly why his destitute, unemployed ex-wife was sitting in a restricted VIP room, surrounded by older, immensely powerful men in bespoke suits. In his deeply narcissistic mind, there was only one logical explanation. He instantly assumed I had somehow discovered his party location, snuck into the restaurant, and found a group of wealthy older men to latch onto, just so I could spy on his happiness. He thought I was a pathetic, desperate stalker begging for his attention. Preston could never let a perceived insult go unanswered. He confidently handed his drink to Lexi, puffed out his chest, and marched directly up the carpeted stairs toward the vault. The heavy glass door swung open. Preston stepped into my private dining room with a condescending smirk plastered across his face. My billionaire guests paused their intense conversation, looking at the intrusive stranger with mild irritation. I simply crossed my legs, resting my hands neatly on the polished oak table. I did not break eye contact. "Are you actually kidding me right now?" Stella Preston scoffed, his voice dripping with loud theatrical pity. He clearly wanted my guests to hear every single word. "I fire you from your sad little accounting job, I kick you out of my life, and your response is to stalk me at my own engagement party. Did you seriously find a couple of sugar daddies to buy you dinner just so you could sit up here and cry while watching me celebrate with the woman I actually love? It is honestly pathetic. Go home. You are embarrassing yourself in front of these gentlemen." One of the tech billionaires sitting to my right raised an eyebrow, highly amused by the sheer audacity of this random mid-level venture capitalist. He looked at me silently, asking if he should call his personal security team to have the man physically removed. I gave my guest a very slight shake of my head. I wanted to handle this myself. I did not yell. I did not defend myself. I did not explain that the quiet men sitting next to me could buy and sell his entire venture capital firm before breakfast. I simply leaned forward and began to tap my manicured fingernails against the hard wood of the table, a slow, methodical ticking rhythm. "Preston," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying a lethal razor-sharp edge that instantly wiped the arrogant smirk right off his face. "That cherry-red Porsche Carrera parked outside right now. License plate 8899. You purchased it in cash on the 14th of this month." Preston froze completely. His jaw locked tight. His eyes darted nervously toward my guests, then back to me. The confident posture he had brought into the room suddenly vanished into thin air. "You also signed a prepaid annual lease for a Gold Coast penthouse on the exact same day," I continued, my voice smooth and perfectly flat. "Both of those transactions were funded by a Delaware shell company. A shell company that was heavily injected with capital you quietly drained directly from the Alpha Pension Fund. You stole the retirement savings of union workers to buy a sports car for the girl downstairs." The silence in the vault became suffocating. Preston stopped breathing. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking like an absolute ghost in a tailored suit. His mind was violently short-circuiting. He could not fathom how his boring, unemployed wife possessed the highly classified financial data he had buried beneath multiple layers of corporate security. I picked up my glass of sparkling water, took a very slow, elegant sip, and placed it back down on the coaster. "I suggest you go back downstairs and enjoy your expensive champagne, Preston," I said, staring directly into his terrified wide eyes. "Enjoy the applause. Enjoy the superficial friends. And most importantly, I highly suggest you enjoy the absolute final days you get to spend wearing those custom silk suits. because very soon your wardrobe is going to be incredibly restricted." Preston did not say a single word in response. He could not speak. A visible layer of cold sweat broke out across his forehead, glistening under the restaurant lights. His chest heaved with sudden, uncontrolled panic. He took a stumbling step backward, nearly tripping over the thick carpet. He turned around and practically fled from the VIP room, the heavy glass door slamming shut behind him. He did not return to his laughing friends. He did not return to his shiny new fiancée. I watched through the tinted glass as Preston shoved his way through the crowded dining floor, completely ignoring Lexi as she called out his name in confusion. He burst through the emergency exit doors, escaping into the freezing Chicago night. Standing alone in the dark alley behind the restaurant, hyperventilating and completely terrified, Preston pulled out his cell phone with violently shaking hands. He bypassed his corporate lawyers. He bypassed his firm. He immediately dialed his parents. He desperately needed Richard and Brenda to use every single ounce of their social influence and financial leverage to find a way to crush me permanently before I could trigger the explosive detonator I had just revealed. The war had officially escalated, and he finally realized he was severely outgunned. The morning after the engagement party disaster, I walked into a luxury cafe in downtown Chicago to grab a simple black coffee. When I handed the barista my standard debit card, the machine beeped with a loud, obnoxious red glare. Declined. I handed her a second card. Declined again. My phone instantly buzzed with an automated alert from my primary banking institution. An emergency ex parte order had been executed at 9:00 sharp, placing a temporary total freeze on my personal financial assets. I stepped out of the cafe, the freezing wind whipping against my tailored coat. I pulled up the legal notification on my encrypted phone. Richard, Brenda, and Preston's older sister Rachel had officially launched their counterattack. Rachel, utilizing a few shady connections she maintained within the local judicial system, had spearheaded a vicious petition. They formally accused me of grand larceny, claiming I had systematically drained Preston's marital assets and hidden the funds in offshore accounts. They demanded a total freeze on everything I owned, attempting to completely paralyze me. They genuinely believed that by cutting off my access to money, I would be starved into submission, forced to crawl back on my hands and knees to beg for a meager settlement. They thought they had successfully orchestrated a brilliant, lethal ambush. Less than 48 hours later, an emergency hearing was convened in a high-rise courthouse overlooking the city. I pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the hearing room and stepped inside. Richard, Brenda, and Rachel were already seated at the petitioner table. They looked absolutely triumphant. Brenda wore a smug, self-satisfied grin, adjusting her diamond necklace while whispering something to Rachel. They were entirely convinced they had backed a helpless, penniless orphan into a corner she could never escape. I walked calmly down the center aisle, my heels clicking sharply against the polished wood floor. I did not take a seat at the defense table alone. The heavy doors swung open a second time. Terrence strode into the courtroom, his broad shoulders filling a bespoke midnight blue suit. He carried a sleek leather briefcase, his expression carved from absolute stone. The moment Richard, Brenda, and Rachel registered who had just walked in, the triumphant smiles instantly vanished from their faces, replaced by utter paralyzing shock. Rachel shot up from her chair, her face flushing a furious shade of crimson. "Terrence, what in the world are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice vibrating with sheer disbelief and outrage. "You are my husband. You belong on this side of the room. Get over here right now." Terrence did not even spare his wife a single glance. He walked directly to my side of the defense table, placed his leather briefcase down, and snapped the brass locks open. He looked up at the judge, projecting the undeniable commanding authority of a top-tier corporate litigator. "Your Honor, I am officially representing the defendant in this matter," Terrence stated, his deep voice echoing powerfully through the silent courtroom. "I have thoroughly reviewed the petitioner's claims of asset misappropriation, and I am prepared to demonstrate that this entire filing is nothing more than a malicious, fabricated attempt at financial harassment." Brenda let out a loud, dramatic gasp. Richard slammed his fist onto his table. "This is an absolute outrage," Richard bellowed, his face turning purple. "He is family. He cannot do this. This is a severe conflict of interest." Terence calmly adjusted his suit jacket, turning his cold gaze toward his father-in-law. "I am a corporate attorney, Richard. My professional obligation is to the truth and to the law. My client has been subjected to a coordinated bad faith attack by people who drastically overestimate their own intelligence." The judge banged the gavel, demanding order, and instructed Terence to proceed. What followed was a spectacular, flawlessly executed legal slaughter. It took Terence exactly 15 minutes to completely dismantle their entire petition. He did not just argue. He presented a mountain of irrefutable, heavily authenticated documentation. He handed the judge pristine copies of my irrevocable trust agreement stamped and certified years before I ever met Preston. He provided ironclad prenuptial financial disclosures that clearly delineated my personal independent wealth from Preston's heavily leveraged accounts. He submitted certified forensic audits proving that not a single cent of Preston's money had ever crossed into my possession. Every dollar I owned was legally, undeniably mine, generated through my own highly successful independent corporate endeavors. The judge flipped through the thick stack of undeniable evidence, his expression darkening with visible irritation. He looked up at Richard, Brenda, and Rachel, his patience entirely depleted. The judge slammed his gavel down instantly, throwing out their frivolous injunction and ordering the immediate unfreezing of all my financial accounts. But Terence was not finished. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a second stack of legal documents. He walked smoothly across the aisle and dropped the heavy paperwork directly in front of a horrified Rachel. "Since the petitioners have decided to weaponize the judicial system to conduct a bad faith smear campaign, my client is officially filing a countersuit," Terence announced, his voice slicing through the room like a blade. "We are seeking maximum punitive damages for malicious prosecution, defamation, and coordinated harassment. We will see you all back in court very soon." Rachel stared at the countersuit, her hands shaking violently. Brenda looked like she was about to faint, leaning heavily against Richard, who was completely speechless. The invincible, untouchable family had just been publicly humiliated and legally crushed by the very man they had spent 8 years treating like a second-class citizen. They had foolishly assumed that Terence would always remain the quiet, obedient background character they had conditioned him to be. Now they were staring directly at their own catastrophic downfall, delivered with absolute chilling professionalism by a man who refused to be disrespected for another second. Word of the disastrous courtroom slaughter reached Preston less than an hour later. He was standing in his corner office staring out at the Chicago skyline when his phone rang with the news. His grand aggressive strategy to silence me had failed spectacularly. I was not starved out. I was not intimidated. I was heavily armed, legally protected, and actively firing back with devastating precision. Preston hurled his cell phone across the office, shattering it against the glass wall. He gripped his hair, completely consumed by raw, unadulterated panic. The timing of this catastrophic failure was an absolute nightmare. His venture capital fund was currently entering the final high-stakes negotiation phase for the massive $400 million acquisition of Aegis Shield. If this deal fell through, his massive embezzlement would be uncovered by the inevitable internal audit, and he would spend the next 2 decades in a federal penitentiary. His entire survival depended on closing that exact deal. And out there roaming the city with total financial freedom and a lethal lawyer by her side was his ex-wife holding the match to his powder keg. The atmosphere inside the glass-walled executive boardroom of Preston's venture capital firm was suffocatingly tense. The firm was currently mobilizing an unprecedented $400 million in liquid capital to aggressively acquire Aegis Shield, the most dominant and elusive cybersecurity corporation in North America. The managing partners had officially designated Preston as the lead negotiator for this monumental transaction. For the firm, this acquisition represented a crowning achievement in their portfolio. But for Preston, this single deal was an absolute matter of life and death. In a literal federal prison sense, the mathematics of his desperate situation were brutally simple. If he successfully orchestrated the Aegis Shield buyout by Friday, the firm would instantly promote him to senior partner. That promotion carried an immediate massive 8-figure commission bonus. That cash infusion was his only remaining lifeline. He desperately needed that specific bonus to silently replenish the severely depleted union workers' retirement fund before the mandatory quarterly audit exposed his massive embezzlement. The stolen funds he had used to purchase Lexi's luxury penthouse and sports car were sitting like a ticking time bomb inside his financial ledgers. Aegis Shield was the only viable extinguisher he had left to defuse the incoming explosion. He paced relentlessly across the expensive imported rugs of his office, staring at the glowing screens of his terminal, his tailored suit feeling uncomfortably tight around his neck. Lexi was constantly texting him, demanding more expensive gifts, and complaining about the stress of the divorce, completely oblivious to the fact that her luxurious lifestyle was currently funded by stolen pension money. The primary obstacle driving Preston into a state of sheer panic was the absolute impenetrable wall of secrecy surrounding the target company. The creator of Aegis Shield was famously known throughout the tech industry as a phantom. Nobody knew the founder's name, gender, or location. Preston was accustomed to wining and dining tech developers, taking them to expensive steakhouses, and burying them under overwhelming displays of wealth. He tried to deploy his usual aggressive tactics. He frantically sent dozens of highly polished, incredibly desperate emails to the encrypted administrative contact listed for Aegis Shield. He practically begged for a brief 10-minute video conference or a quick private coffee meeting with the visionary founder. He crafted long, sycophantic paragraphs praising the anonymous genius behind the software, promising the world and guaranteeing maximum autonomy after the acquisition. Every single one of his urgent requests was met with a cold, automated rejection. The automated replies consistently stated that the founder maintained strict corporate anonymity protocols and did not participate in preliminary financial negotiations. Preston was absolutely infuriated. He was forced to submit his offers blindly through a wall of incredibly aggressive anonymous corporate lawyers who contested every single decimal point in his term sheets. He would sit in his office clenching his fists and screaming at his computer screen, entirely powerless against the faceless entity blocking his path to salvation. Miles away, sitting comfortably in my secure, climate-controlled server room, I was the one reading every single pathetic, groveling email my soon-to-be ex-husband sent. I sipped my dark coffee, highly amused by the sheer desperation bleeding through his supposedly professional vocabulary. He was practically crawling on his digital hands and knees, begging the anonymous tech billionaire to save his career, completely unaware that the billionaire he was desperately trying to impress was the exact same woman he had just publicly humiliated and attempted to leave penniless on the street. It was a spectacular display of cosmic irony, and I savored every single second of his pathetic struggle. I instructed my legal team, now officially headed by Terrence, to deliberately stall the negotiations. We deliberately dragged out the grueling due diligence phase, requesting endless revisions to the non-disclosure agreements and forcing Preston to jump through impossible bureaucratic hoops. We were expertly winding the financial rope tighter and tighter around his neck. Preston was sweating bullets, struggling to maintain his confident, untouchable facade in front of his firm's managing partners. He strutted through his office daily, loudly assuring his bosses that the Aegis Shield deal was completely under control and simply undergoing standard legal review. He was lying through his teeth, gambling his entire professional existence and his freedom on a blind transaction he had absolutely no power over. The immense pressure was making him increasingly volatile, but Preston possessed a severely dangerous level of narcissistic delusion. He genuinely believed his own lies. He convinced himself that closing the Aegis Shield deal was an absolute certainty, a predetermined destiny that would instantly solve all of his criminal problems and elevate him to the highest echelon of Chicago high society. He decided that this massive, impending financial victory was the perfect weapon to wield in our upcoming legal battle. The morning of our preliminary divorce hearing finally arrived. The stakes could not possibly be higher. Preston strapped on his most expensive custom-tailored suit, adjusted his imported silk tie, and checked his reflection with arrogant satisfaction. He planned to walk into that downtown courtroom and completely dominate the narrative. He fully intended to proudly announce his position as the lead negotiator on a historic $400 million tech acquisition. He wanted to use the sheer staggering magnitude of the Aegis Shield deal to dazzle the presiding judge, establish his absolute financial supremacy, and portray me as a bitter, insignificant accountant who deserved nothing but a meager, dismissive settlement. His ego was completely detached from reality. He envisioned the judge bowing down to his corporate brilliance, handing him total victory, and leaving me with nothing but the clothes on my back. He strutted out of his luxury apartment, tossing the keys to his remaining sports car to the valet fully prepared to destroy me. He was marching directly into the courthouse, entirely confident that his impending promotion would effectively shield him from any consequences, completely unaware that he was walking straight into a meticulously designed legal slaughterhouse. The heavy oak doors of the downtown family court swung open. Preston strutted down the center aisle looking like a man who had already won the war. He wore a brand new, bespoke charcoal suit and a smug expression that practically screamed entitlement. His high-priced divorce attorney walked beside him carrying a thin leather briefcase. They took their seats at the petitioner table. I sat quietly at the defense table. Terrence sat to my right, organizing a massive stack of perfectly tabbed manila folders. Terrence wore a sharp navy suit, looking every bit the lethal corporate litigator he was. The presiding judge, a stern man with silver hair and a reputation for zero tolerance, adjusted his glasses and called the preliminary hearing to order. Preston adjusted his silk tie and puffed out his chest. His attorney stood up and immediately launched into a theatrical, aggressive opening statement. "Your Honor, my client is a highly respected venture capital executive," his attorney proclaimed, gesturing toward Preston, who tried to look appropriately solemn. "Throughout this 5-year marriage, my client has been the sole financial provider. He has funded a life of absolute luxury for the defendant. However, we have recently uncovered deeply concerning financial irregularities. The defendant is a specialized forensic accountant. We have reason to firmly believe she has been systematically hiding massive amounts of marital assets in offshore accounts and secret trusts, because she currently refuses to disclose her true net worth. My client is officially petitioning this court for immediate and substantial spousal support." I had to physically bite the inside of my cheek to stop myself from laughing out loud, right there in the courtroom. Preston was actually demanding alimony. He was actively bleeding his firm dry to fund his 24-year-old mistress, and he had the sheer, unadulterated audacity to ask the court to force me to pay for his lifestyle. The judge frowned, looking over his reading glasses at our table. "Counsel, do you have a response to these allegations of hidden assets and the request for spousal support?" Terrence stood up slowly. He buttoned his suit jacket, projecting absolute undeniable authority. He did not look angry. He looked incredibly dangerous. "Your Honor, we completely reject the premise of this petition," Terrence stated, his deep voice ringing clearly across the quiet courtroom. "Not only is the request for spousal support entirely legally baseless, but the petitioner has committed blatant perjury on his sworn financial affidavit. My client has hidden absolutely nothing. The petitioner, however, has been actively and aggressively dissipating marital assets to fund an illicit extramarital affair." Preston scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes. His attorney jumped up, shouting an objection, but the judge banged his gavel, demanding order, and instructed Terrence to proceed. Terrence calmly walked over to the clerk's desk and handed over 3 thick, heavy folders. "Your Honor, I am submitting irrefutable financial documentation traced directly by my client, who, as opposing counsel noted, is an expert forensic accountant. These documents prove that exactly 48 hours before filing for divorce, the petitioner wired $250,000 to secure an annual lease on a Gold Coast luxury penthouse. On that exact same day, he wired an additional $185,400 to purchase a brand new Porsche Carrera in cash. Preston froze. The color instantly vanished from his arrogant face. He stared at Terence in pure, unadulterated horror. He had assumed his shell companies were completely untraceable. He never imagined his boring ex-wife possessed the technical capability to shatter his financial firewalls. Both of these exorbitant purchases were placed exclusively in the name of his 24-year-old subordinate employee. Terence continued, his voice slicing through the heavy silence like a razor blade. The petitioner is deliberately draining marital capital and attempting to leave my client financially destitute. Furthermore, the origin of these specific funds is currently highly questionable and requires immediate federal auditing. The judge opened the folders. He scrutinized the highlighted bank statements, the wire transfer confirmation codes, and the vehicle registration documents. The courtroom was so entirely silent, you could hear the air conditioning humming through the vents. The judge flipped to the final page, his expression hardening into a mask of pure judicial fury. Preston began to sweat profusely. He grabbed his attorney's sleeve frantically, whispering for him to do something to stop this disaster, but his highly paid lawyer simply stared at the damning evidence in complete disbelief. "This is an absolute outrage." The judge finally spoke, his voice echoing like thunder. "Mr. Preston, you stand before this court requesting spousal support while simultaneously hemorrhaging hundreds of thousands of dollars on luxury vehicles and real estate for a third party. You have deliberately filed a fraudulent financial affidavit." "Your Honor, I can explain." Preston stammered, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "Those funds were in advance on a massive corporate acquisition I am currently negotiating. It is highly confidential. I do not care if you are buying the moon." The judge snapped, slamming his hand onto the heavy wooden bench. "You do not dissipate assets on the eve of a divorce proceeding. Given the extreme flight risk of capital demonstrated by these heavily documented wire transfers, I am taking immediate preventative action." The judge picked up his pen and began signing a series of emergency orders. "Effective immediately, I am granting the defense request for a total asset freeze," the judge declared loudly. "Every single personal bank account, investment portfolio, and line of credit carrying your name or your social security number is officially frozen pending a comprehensive independent forensic audit. You are completely barred from accessing, transferring, or liquidating any capital whatsoever." Preston lost his mind. He leaped out of his chair, screaming at the top of his lungs, "You cannot do this. I have a $400 million tech deal closing this week. I am a senior executive. You are ruining my entire life over a misunderstanding." The bailiff instantly stepped forward, resting his hand heavily on his utility belt. The judge glared down from the bench, his eyes blazing with absolute zero tolerance. "One more word and I will hold you in contempt and place you in a holding cell right now," the judge warned sharply. "This hearing is adjourned." Preston stood entirely paralyzed, breathing heavily as the devastating reality of his new situation crashed down onto his shoulders. He had walked into this courtroom expecting to completely crush me. Instead, he had just been financially decapitated. Terence calmly packed his briefcase, giving Preston a cold, satisfied nod before escorting me out of the double doors. We had achieved total, absolute victory. 20 minutes later, Preston stumbled out of the courthouse. He was sweating, shaking, and entirely unhinged. He desperately needed a moment to process the absolute nightmare that had just occurred. He walked across the busy downtown street toward a high-end boutique cafe, where Lexi was waiting for him at a patio table. She was wearing designer sunglasses and holding her expensive new handbag, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic slaughter that had just taken place inside the courtroom. Preston approached the outdoor counter, his hands trembling violently. He ordered 2 simple black coffees, just needing the caffeine to settle his racing heart. He pulled out his sleek, heavy metal credit card and handed it to the barista. He tried to force a confident smile, but his facial muscles were completely rigid. The barista swiped the card through the terminal. The machine let out a sharp, obnoxious beep. The barista frowned and swiped the heavy metal card a second time. The machine beeped again, flashing a bright red error message across the small digital screen. "I am so sorry, sir," the barista said, handing the card back with an apologetic smile. "It says your card has been completely declined." Preston stared at the piece of metal in his shaking hand, realizing that his entire glamorous, luxurious life had just been instantly terminated. The heavy mahogany doors of Richard and Brenda's suburban estate slammed shut. The opulent foyer felt like a highly pressurized interrogation room. Terence stepped onto the imported marble floor, loosening the collar of his crisp dress shirt. He had been summoned to this emergency family dinner under the guise of a civil discussion, but the hostile energy radiating from the dining room told a completely different story. He walked through the arched doorway to find the entire family waiting for him like a firing squad. Richard sat at the head of the long oak table, his face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. Brenda stood by the fireplace, crossing her arms, tightly glaring at him with pure venom. Rachel, his own wife, sat next to her parents, refusing to even meet his eyes. And pacing frantically in the corner was Preston. The golden boy looked absolutely miserable. His custom suit was wrinkled, his tie discarded, and he clutched a glass of scotch with white knuckles. The reality of his frozen bank accounts had clearly pushed him to the brink of a mental breakdown. "You have a lot of nerve showing your face in this house," Richard barked, slamming his palm flat against the polished dining table. "I want an explanation right now. What kind of sick game are you playing by representing that gold digger in a federal courtroom?" Terence did not flinch. He walked slowly toward the table, projecting the exact same lethal calm he used during high-stakes corporate litigation. "I am a licensed attorney, Richard. Stella came to me requiring aggressive legal representation against a coordinated bad faith attack initiated by this exact family. I took the case. It is that simple." Brenda let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Simple? You call betraying your own family simple? We welcomed you into this home. We gave you a seat at our table. We introduced you to the highest society in Chicago. And this is how you repay our immense generosity. You stab your own brother-in-law in the back to defend a nobody from the foster care system." Rachel finally stood up, her voice trembling with self-righteous anger. "Terence, you need to drop her as a client immediately. You are completely humiliating us. Preston's entire career is on the line right now. He has a massive venture capital deal closing this week, and you are actively helping his vindictive ex-wife destroy his reputation. You are going to call the judge tomorrow morning, withdraw from the case, and apologize to my brother." Terence stopped walking. The sheer audacity of their demands hung heavily in the suffocating air. They genuinely believed they owned him. A cold, dangerous smile spread across his face. He reached up slowly, untied his expensive silk cravat, and pulled it from his neck. He tossed the dark fabric onto the center of the pristine dining table. The careless, disrespectful gesture made Brenda visibly gasp. "Family," Terence repeated, letting the word roll off his tongue like toxic poison. "You want to lecture me about family loyalty and acceptance? Do not insult my intelligence, Brenda. I know exactly what you all say when I leave the room. I know you sit around this very table drinking expensive wine and calling me the lucky black guy who climbed the social ladder by marrying your daughter. I know Richard constantly tells his golf buddies that I only made partner at my firm because of diversity quotas. You have never not, for a single second, viewed me as your equal. You tolerate my presence because my corporate salary funds your daughter's luxury lifestyle, and my legal expertise is a convenient tool for your dirty work." Richard opened his mouth to shout a furious denial, but Terence instantly cut him off, his deep voice booming with undeniable, terrifying authority. "Do not even try to deny it, Richard. I have spent 8 long years biting my tongue, enduring your racist microaggressions, and playing the role of the grateful son-in-law. But that absolutely ends tonight. I am a top-tier corporate litigator. I built my career on facts and relentless accountability. My professional loyalty belongs to the truth, not to a family of arrogant, insecure narcissists." Rachel took a step forward, tears welling in her eyes. "Terence, please stop. You are destroying everything we have built." "No, Rachel." Terence said, his tone softening slightly, but remaining incredibly firm. Your brother is the one destroying everything. I am not a messy divorce lawyer. I only step into the courtroom to protect innocent people from calculated corporate destruction, and most importantly, I only protect people who do not aggressively steal money from their own trusting clients. The moment those specific words left Terrence's mouth, the entire dynamic of the room violently shifted. Preston, who had been pacing near the fireplace, instantly froze. The glass of scotch slipped from his trembling hand, shattering loudly against the stone hearth. Amber liquid pooled across the expensive rug, but nobody moved to clean it up. Preston's heart practically stopped beating in his chest. His breathing became rapid and shallow. Steal money from clients. He heard the phrase echo in his mind like a blaring air raid siren. Terrence knew. Terrence actually knew about the embezzled union pension funds. The titanium USB drive he had handed Stella was not just random divorce ammunition. It was an explosive financial audit of his catastrophic corporate crimes. Terrence did not wait for their stunned reactions to process. He reached out, grabbing Rachel by her wrist with a firm, uncompromising grip. "We are leaving," he announced to the completely paralyzed room. "If any of you ever attempt to contact me or my client with another fraudulent legal threat, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your miserable lives buried in federal subpoenas." He turned on his heel, pulling a shocked and silent Rachel out of the dining room. The heavy front doors opened and closed, leaving a deafening, terrifying silence in their wake. Preston collapsed onto the nearest leather armchair, clutching his chest as a full-blown panic attack seized his body. His parents were shouting confused questions at him, but all sound was entirely muffled. Terrence was a corporate compliance officer. He was legally obligated to report massive financial crimes. Preston stared blankly at the shattered glass on the floor, his mind consumed by a singular, horrifying realization. Terrence and Stella had not just fought back in family court. They had likely already handed the entire explosive dossier directly over to the Securities and Exchange Commission. The federal government was coming for him, and his lavish, arrogant life was officially over. The terror inside Preston mutated into a reckless, suffocating desperation. He paced the hardwood floors of the Gold Coast penthouse, his expensive leather shoes wearing a visible path into the pristine carpet. Lexi sat curled on the velvet sofa, clutching a crystal glass of sparkling water, watching him with a mixture of annoyance and dawning anxiety. The reality of the frozen assets had finally penetrated her superficial bubble. The designer boutiques were suddenly off limits. The luxury spa memberships were instantly suspended. But for Preston, the frozen credit cards were the absolute least of his problems. The phrase Terrence had spoken echoed relentlessly in his skull like a blaring siren. Stealing money from clients. If Terrence knew about the embezzled union pension funds, it was only a matter of hours before the firm initiated a comprehensive internal audit. Preston knew exactly how those audits functioned. An independent compliance team would temporarily lock him out of the main servers, dissect his portfolio transactions, and instantly discover the massive, glaring crater where the $400,000 used to be. Once they found the missing capital, the Securities and Exchange Commission would be notified immediately. He would be arrested in his own office, paraded out in handcuffs in front of the entire venture capital firm. He needed liquid cash immediately. He needed to replace the stolen pension funds before the auditors even started looking. But his hands were completely tied. The family court judge had paralyzed his legitimate financial mobility. He could not liquidate his stock options. He could not take out a personal bank loan. He could not even borrow against his retirement accounts. He stopped pacing and turned toward Lexi, his eyes wild and bloodshot. "We need capital right now," he demanded, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "I need $2 million in untraceable immediate liquidity to plug the holes in my ledger and keep this entire lifestyle afloat until Friday." Lexi stared at him, her perfectly glossed lips parting in confusion. $2 million, Preston. Your accounts are locked. My credit score is practically non-existent. How on earth are we supposed to get that kind of cash by tomorrow morning? Preston walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the glittering Chicago skyline. "We do not use a bank," he stated, a dark, dangerous resolve settling over his features. "We use the shadow market." Lexi stood up, her high heels sinking into the plush rug. "Shadow lenders. Preston, those are dangerous people. You are talking about unregulated private equity syndicates, loan sharks in tailored suits. If you default on a bridge loan like that, they do not just ruin your credit score, they ruin your physical life." Preston grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip tight and unyielding. "I am not going to default. Listen to me very carefully. This Friday, I am closing the $400 million acquisition of Aegis Shield. The managing partners have already guaranteed my promotion to senior partner the moment the ink dries on that contract. That promotion comes with an immediate $12 million commission bonus. I just need a temporary bridge loan to survive the next 4 days. Once the Aegis bonus clears my account on Friday afternoon, I will pay off the shadow lenders, return the union pension funds, and wipe my digital slate completely clean. Nobody will ever know a single dollar was missing." He needed a clean proxy to secure the illegal funds. He marched over to his briefcase and pulled out a stack of blank corporate authorization forms. He looked at Lexi, his expression hardening into pure manipulation. "I need you to sign as the primary guarantor," he instructed, sliding the documents onto the glass coffee table. "Your name is not tied to the family court asset freeze. We will use the venture capital firm's name as the corporate backing to guarantee the collateral, but the funds will be routed directly through your newly registered limited liability company. It is completely foolproof." Lexi hesitated, her eyes scanning the dense legal jargon on the shadow loan application. The interest rates were absolutely astronomical, compounding daily. The penalty clauses were brutal and unforgiving. But she looked around the lavish penthouse, thinking about the cherry-red Porsche parked in the VIP garage downstairs. She was utterly terrified of losing her newfound status. Driven by pure greed and a fundamental misunderstanding of the extreme danger she was placing herself in, Lexi picked up the silver pen and signed her name on every single dotted line, officially tying her own fate to Preston's sinking ship. Within 2 hours, Preston utilized his deepest, darkest connections in the Chicago financial underworld. He transmitted the fraudulently backed application to an unregulated private syndicate known for funding high-risk, off-the-books corporate ventures. Because the application falsely bore the prestigious seal of his venture capital firm, the shadow lenders approved the $2 million transfer instantly. The dirty money was successfully wired into Lexi's dummy account. Preston collapsed onto the velvet sofa, letting out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. He genuinely believed he had just outsmarted the entire system. He thought he had successfully outmaneuvered the family court judge, outplayed Terrence, and secured his path to absolute victory. He poured himself a fresh glass of scotch, entirely convinced that Friday would crown him as an untouchable corporate king. He was spectacularly wrong. Miles away, securely locked inside the subterranean war room of Aegis Shield, the massive digital surveillance monitors flared to life with blaring crimson alerts. I sat in my command chair, my fingers flying rapidly across the illuminated mechanical keyboard. I did not even need to actively search for Preston's desperate maneuvers. He had foolishly routed the illegal shadow loan through the exact same financial nodes I was already heavily monitoring. A detailed real-time map of the illicit money transfer populated on my central screen. I watched the $2 million originate from a flagged offshore syndicate account, bypass federal regulatory checks, and land squarely inside Lexi's newly minted shell corporation. I analyzed the digital signatures attached to the loan agreement. Preston had blatantly committed corporate identity theft by using his firm's official credentials to back an illegal, unauthorized loan. Terrence stood behind me, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes fixed on the cascading streams of undeniable evidence. He just committed multiple new counts of federal wire fraud and aggravated corporate forgery. Terrence noted, his voice low and incredibly satisfied. He practically tied the noose, stepped onto the trapdoor, and handed us the lever. I leaned back in my leather chair, a cold, predatory smile curving my lips. I pressed a single key, archiving the entire fraudulent transaction into an impenetrable, encrypted vault. I had every single piece of his catastrophic puzzle locked securely in my possession. The trap was no longer just set. The steel jaws were firmly locked into place. Preston was blindly marching toward Friday, expecting a massive corporate coronation, utterly unaware that he had just personally financed his own spectacular, inescapable destruction. Lexi lounged across the velvet sofa inside the newly leased Gold Coast penthouse. She held a crystal glass of expensive sparkling water in one hand and her latest generation smartphone in the other. The panic that had briefly gripped her when Preston revealed his frozen bank accounts had completely vanished. It was entirely replaced by a profound, intoxicating sense of invincibility. She had just signed her name on a massive stack of complex corporate loan documents, blissfully unaware that she had legally bound herself to a ruthless syndicate of underground shadow lenders. In her severely limited understanding of high finance, she truly believed Preston had simply pulled a brilliant executive loophole out of thin air. He had miraculously manifested $2 million in untraceable cash, completely bypassing the furious family court judge and the rigid banking regulations. To Lexi, this was the ultimate proof of his supreme dominance. He was a financial god, and she was his chosen deity. She looked around the sprawling, sunlit apartment and then down at the keys to her cherry red sports car resting on the glass coffee table. A vicious, petty urge began to bubble up inside her chest. She was not satisfied with simply having the luxury lifestyle. She desperately needed to rub it directly into the face of the woman who had previously occupied her spot. She wanted to ensure the boring, discarded forensic accountant understood exactly how thoroughly she had been replaced. Lexi opened her messaging application and navigated to the contact number she had scraped from Preston's digital address book. Her manicured thumbs flew across the illuminated screen, carefully crafting the most venomous, arrogant message she could possibly construct. "Do you see it now?" Lexi typed, a wicked smile curving her glossy lips. "Even with a court-ordered asset freeze, he still finds a way to take perfect care of me. He will always win. Make sure you tune in to watch our $1 million wedding next month, you absolute failure." She pressed send with a sharp, triumphant tap of her fingernail. She tossed the phone onto the velvet cushion, entirely convinced she had just delivered the final devastating mental blow to a defeated enemy. Miles away, deep inside the subterranean climate-controlled command center of Aegis Shield, the notification illuminated my private cell phone screen. I was currently reviewing the final, heavily encrypted audit reports detailing Preston's catastrophic embezzlement and his brand-new, highly illegal syndicate loan. Terrence stood directly behind my leather chair, his arms crossed over his broad chest, reviewing a separate stack of federal compliance statutes. I picked up the phone and opened the message. I read the gloating, pathetic words silently. I did not feel a single ounce of anger. I did not feel threatened, jealous, or insulted. I only felt a profound, almost clinical pity for the 24-year-old girl who was actively dancing on the deck of a sinking ship. Terrence leaned down, his eyes scanning the glowing screen over my shoulder. He let out a low, rumbling chuckle that echoed through the quiet server room. "She genuinely believes that $2 million came from his own brilliance," Terrence noted, his deep voice laced with dark amusement. "She has absolutely no idea she is currently the primary guarantor for a syndicate of violent loan sharks. She is planning a $1 million wedding with money that belongs to criminals while wearing jewelry bought with stolen union pension funds. The sheer magnitude of their combined delusion belongs in a medical textbook." I placed the phone back onto the mahogany desk. Lexi wanted a reaction. She desperately wanted me to curse at her, to type out long, furious paragraphs defending my pride, or to block her number in a fit of bitter tears. She wanted the validation of knowing she had successfully inflicted emotional pain. I refused to give her a single inch of that satisfaction. Instead, I picked the device back up and typed out a response. I did not use insults. I did not mention the frozen accounts, the shadow lenders, or the stolen pension money. I simply offered her a piece of highly practical advice regarding her upcoming social calendar. I typed exactly one sentence, Remember to wear your best outfit this Friday. There will be a lot of camera lenses that day. I hit send, locked the screen, and returned my absolute focus to the digital trap I was actively tightening around their necks. Back in the penthouse, Lexi's phone buzzed. She eagerly snatched it up, fully expecting a frantic emotional meltdown from a broken ex-wife. When she read the single cryptic line of text, she blinked in sheer confusion. She read it a second time, and then a loud, triumphant laugh escaped her throat. In her profoundly superficial mind, she completely misinterpreted the message. She knew that Preston's venture capital firm was finalizing the massive $400 million acquisition of Aegis Shield this coming Friday. Preston had been loudly bragging about it all week. Lexi instantly assumed that I had been reading the local financial blogs and had accepted my total defeat. She thought I was bitterly acknowledging that Friday would be Preston's ultimate corporate coronation, complete with press photographers and industry journalists, documenting his historic promotion to senior partner. She genuinely believed I was bowing down to their supreme victory. The very next morning, Lexi strutted into the towering glass lobby of the venture capital firm like she owned the entire skyscraper. She wore a brand new designer outfit, her expensive handbag swinging from her arm. Instead of quietly heading to her assistant desk, she paraded directly into the center of the bustling corporate bullpen. She wanted to ensure that every single employee, from the junior analysts to the executive secretaries, knew exactly who she was and what was about to happen. "Listen up, everyone," Lexi announced loudly, clapping her hands together to draw the attention of the entire floor. "You better make sure this office is absolutely spotless by the end of the week. Preston is officially signing the biggest, most historic tech acquisition in this firm's entire history this Friday. It is going to be a record-breaking deal. I want the champagne ordered, the caterers booked, and the press room completely prepped. There are going to be a massive amount of media cameras here to document his promotion." The office erupted into a flurry of excited whispers and frantic preparations. The junior staff immediately began making calls to local business journalists and corporate photographers, acting on the bold instructions of the incoming senior partner's fiancé. Lexi stood in the center of the room, soaking in the attention and the perceived power. She had just taken my cold, calculated warning and willfully transformed it into a massive, highly publicized marketing campaign for her own fiancé. She was personally ensuring that the entire financial district of Chicago would have their eyes firmly fixed on the firm's executive boardroom. She thought she was building a glorious stage for a corporate king. She had absolutely no idea she had just sent out formal engraved invitations to a public execution. The secure line on my desk rarely rang with unscheduled calls, but my personal cell phone vibrating next to my encrypted workstation was a different story. The caller identification displayed Preston's name. I let it vibrate against the polished mahogany for a few seconds, watching the screen light up the dim server room. Terrence, who was sitting across the room reviewing the final whistleblower complaints for the Securities and Exchange Commission, looked up and raised an eyebrow. I gave him a subtle nod and picked up the device. I pressed the green button, answered the call, and placed the phone on speaker mode. Preston did not even bother with a greeting. A sharp, arrogant laugh blasted through the audio speaker, carrying the distinct hollow echo of his spacious glass-walled corner office. He sounded incredibly manic, vibrating with an intoxicating mixture of extreme adrenaline, expensive bourbon, and sheer, unfiltered narcissism. "You really thought you had me beat?" Preston sneered, his voice dripping with absolute venom and triumphant superiority. "You and that treacherous lawyer actually believed you could freeze my accounts and starve me out. You thought you were so brilliant playing your little forensic accountant games in the courtroom. Well, I have some breaking news for you, Stella. I just received the official clearance notification from the legal department at Aegis Shield. We completely passed their final rigorous due diligence vetting process. The acquisition is a total lock." I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair, my eyes focused entirely on the massive curved monitor dominating my desk. Displayed across the glowing high-definition screen was the exact digital contract Preston was currently celebrating. It was the final $400 million acquisition agreement, awaiting the singular encrypted cryptographic signature of the anonymous Aegis Shield founder to execute the transition. My hand rested casually on my computer mouse. I did not say a word. I let him continue his desperate, gloating monologue, allowing him to securely fasten his own financial noose. This Friday morning, my firm is officially signing the paperwork, Preston boasted loudly, his footsteps clicking as he paced around his office. The moment that ink dries, the board is naming me senior partner. Do you have any idea what that means for you? It means I am going to be untouchable. I am walking away with an 8-figure commission bonus by lunchtime. The second that money hits my accounts, I am hiring the most ruthless, aggressive legal defense team in the entire state of Illinois. I am going to utterly crush you. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my specialized biometric security key. I inserted the sleek metal device into the port on my keyboard, initiating the final administrative override sequence for the pending corporate merger. And I am not just coming for you. Preston continued, his tone turning dark and violently vindictive. I am going to personally destroy Terrence. That ungrateful, disloyal traitor humiliated my parents and turned his back on this family. I will make sure he is completely disbarred. I will drag his name through the mud until he cannot even find work reviewing traffic tickets. As for you, Stella, you better start looking for a cardboard box. Because when my lawyers are finished tearing apart your ridiculous claims, you will be thrown out onto the street with absolutely nothing. You are a complete failure. You are going to be homeless, and I am going to be running the financial district. The system prompted me for my final decision regarding the acquisition. 2 digital buttons glowed on my screen. 1 green button to approve the $400 million transfer. 1 crimson-red button to violently abort the transaction and immediately flag the acquiring firm for severe compliance violations. I placed my finger over the left click button of my mouse. I listened to the sound of Preston breathing heavily through the phone speaker, entirely high on his own fabricated delusional victory. He had taken a $2 million shadow loan from violent criminals just to survive until this exact moment. He was balancing his entire life, his freedom, and his physical safety on the absolute certainty that Aegis Shield would sign that contract. He was incredibly proud of his own supposed brilliance. He truly believed he had outmaneuvered the court system, bypassed my financial freeze, and secured his permanent position in high society. He thought the untraceable money he dumped into Lexi's dummy accounts would keep him afloat, and the pending corporate buyout would instantly wash away all his sins. He was standing on a fragile trapdoor constructed entirely of massive federal crimes, and he was eagerly handing me the lever. I pressed down on my mouse. I clicked the crimson-red button. The massive screen instantly shifted. The $400 million contract dissolved into a flurry of digital code replaced by a stark, undeniable system notification. Transaction terminated. Corporate acquisition permanently canceled. Fraudulent activity logged. The automated system immediately generated a highly detailed rejection mandate, preparing to transmit the catastrophic news to the executive board of Preston's venture capital firm. I placed a temporary precision-timed digital hold on that specific notification. I did not want Preston finding out the deal was dead while he was safely hiding inside his luxury office. I wanted him to find out on Friday morning, standing in a room full of flashing cameras surrounded by his bosses, his parents, and the local business media. I wanted the execution to be spectacular, public, and entirely inescapable. Well, Preston? I finally spoke, my voice ringing with a cold, terrifying calm that instantly silenced his arrogant rant. I am so incredibly glad to hear that you have all of your affairs in perfect order. It sounds like you have planned an absolutely unforgettable day for yourself. Preston scoffed, clearly unnerved by my complete lack of fear or intimidation. You can drop the tough girl act, Stella. You are totally ruined and you know it. Pack your bags. I smoothly reached forward and grasped the top edge of my laptop screen. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer a single emotional insult. I delivered my final promise with the absolute chilling certainty of an apex predator watching a steel trap spring entirely shut. See you on Friday, Preston. I closed the laptop with a sharp, definitive snap, instantly severing the phone connection and plunging his entire world into a deadly, silent countdown. The Aegis Shield Command Center was silent, broken only by cooling units and my tapping keyboard. It was Thursday night, the eve of absolute destruction. I sat at a massive obsidian table, the polished surface reflecting high-definition tactical monitors across the reinforced walls. This room was entirely off the grid, shielded from all external surveillance, a digital fortress where I controlled the fate of multinational corporations. Terrence stood at the opposite end of the table. He was no longer the disrespected son-in-law enduring Richard and Brenda at dinner parties. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, his posture radiating his new reality. As of this morning, Terrence was officially sworn in as the chief legal officer of Aegis Shield. He was now the highest-ranking legal authority for a corporation valued at nearly $1 billion. I pushed a heavy leather-bound dossier across the smooth obsidian surface. The metallic clasp echoed sharply in the quiet room. Terrence caught the folder, sliding it open. "Let us conduct the final tactical review." I stated, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. "I want absolutely zero margin for error when the sun comes up." Terrence nodded, his dark eyes scanning the pristine, heavily encrypted documents we had spent the last 48 hours compiling. He pulled out the first stack of papers, spreading them out under the harsh LED lighting. "Exhibit A," Terrence announced, his deep voice filling the room. "The complete, unredacted financial forensics report detailing Preston's systematic embezzlement. We have the digital signatures and routing codes he used to drain $400,000 from the Union Workers' Retirement Fund. We documented the money trail washing through a Delaware shell corporation into real estate and automotive assets occupied by his mistress. The chain of custody is absolutely flawless. Any federal prosecutor could secure a conviction on this evidence before their morning coffee." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, resting my hands on the armrests. And the shadow-lone Terrence pulled a second, thinner stack of papers from the dossier. The physical copy of the illegal, unregulated bridge loan agreement. Lexi signed the primary guarantor line, binding herself to a violent underground equity syndicate. Preston authorized the $2 million transfer using his firm's credentials, committing corporate identity theft. The loan matures at the exact moment his firm expects our acquisition to close. When that fails, the syndicate will immediately target Lexi for the defaulted $2 million. "She wanted to live in the fast lane," I noted quietly. "Tomorrow she gets to meet the people who own the toll booths." Terrence arranged the final document in the center of the table. It was the absolute crown jewel of our entire operation. Printed on heavy watermarked security paper was the official Aegis Shield corporate mandate. It detailed the immediate permanent termination of the $400 million acquisition. The bottom bore my cryptographic signature and Terrence's seal as chief legal officer. The document cited massive federal compliance violations discovered during the due diligence audit of Preston's portfolio. "Everything is locked, loaded, and completely lethal." Terrence confirmed, stacking the documents back into the leather dossier and snapping the brass lock shut. "Preston will walk into his firm tomorrow morning expecting a massive corporate coronation. His parents are already bragging to their entire social circle about his historic promotion to senior partner. They will show up at his office dressed in fine clothes, expecting to drink champagne and celebrate. They have absolutely no idea they are walking straight into a federal slaughterhouse." I stood up from my chair and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling digital map displaying global network traffic. Preston and his family spent 5 years trying to make me feel completely invisible. They treated you like a convenient accessory. They believed their wealth and their status made them entirely immune to consequence. Tomorrow we educate them on the brutal reality of accountability. Terrence picked up his sleek briefcase, sliding the leather dossier securely inside. "I have finalized the delivery logistics. The package is completely untraceable." We exited the war room, walking down the sterile corridor toward the private elevator. The heavy steel doors slid shut, carrying us up to the surface level of the sleeping city. The harsh Chicago wind whipped through the empty streets as we stepped outside. We did not say another word to each other. The plan was entirely perfect, the evidence was absolute, and the execution was inevitable. Hours passed the deep black of the night, slowly yielding to the fragile, icy blue light of a new day. Friday dawn broke over the freezing concrete canyons of downtown Chicago. The towering glass skyscrapers reflected the early morning sun, hiding the massive financial empires churning inside their walls. At exactly 6 in the morning, an unmarked courier van pulled up to the loading dock of the regional headquarters of the Securities and Exchange Commission. A courier wearing a blank uniform stepped out carrying a thick, sealed, tamper-proof evidence box. He handed the package to the heavily armed security guard stationed at the front desk, scanned an anonymous delivery barcode, and drove away into the morning traffic without a single word. Inside the federal building, an early arriving senior investigator carried his black coffee to his desk. He found the heavy sealed box sitting in the center of his workspace, flagged with a priority label. He set his coffee down, pulled a box cutter from his drawer, and sliced through the tape. He carefully opened the thick brown cardboard flaps, pulling out a pristine, heavy leather-bound dossier. He opened the first page, his eyes scanning the detailed summary of a massive embezzlement scheme operating inside one of the city's most prestigious venture capital firms. The seasoned federal investigator immediately stopped drinking his black steaming morning coffee. He immediately picked up his secure office phone and quickly dialed the direct encrypted extension for the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. 9 o'clock in the morning arrived with blinding sunlight striking the towering glass skyscraper of the prestigious venture capital firm in downtown Chicago. The main lobby was an absolute spectacle of corporate triumph. Camera flashes went off like a relentless strobe light. Industry journalists and aggressive financial reporters crowded behind heavy velvet ropes, clutching audio recorders and microphones, desperate to cover the historic $400 million acquisition of Aegis Shield. This was widely considered the biggest tech buyout of the decade, and the firm had spared absolutely no expense to turn it into a massive media event. Waitstaff in crisp white uniforms circulated through the vast marble foyer, offering flutes of imported vintage champagne to the elite investors and junior partners who had gathered to witness the monumental signing ceremony. The heavy revolving glass doors spun rapidly, and Preston walked into the crowded lobby looking exactly like a conquering king returning from a victorious battle. He wore a brand-new custom-tailored charcoal suit that screamed arrogant wealth and immense power. His posture was rigid with supreme confidence, his chest puffed out eagerly, drinking in the flashing cameras and the undeniable awe of his colleagues. He genuinely believed he had completely outsmarted the entire universe. He thought the $2 million shadow loan had perfectly covered his illicit tracks. He thought his impending promotion to senior partner would instantly shield him from any legal scrutiny. He was smiling a bright, predatory smile for the hungry press, absolutely certain that he was about to permanently cement his legacy as an untouchable titan of the financial district. Walking right beside him, gripping his arm like a hard-won trophy, was Lexi. She paraded proudly through the sea of reporters wearing a skin-tight, fiery red designer dress and holding a massive Hermes bag. She made a deliberate, calculated effort to angle the extremely expensive handbag directly toward the camera lenses, desperately wanting the entire world to see the physical proof of her elevated social status. She smirked openly at the female administrative employees she used to work alongside, radiating pure, toxic superiority. In her intensely superficial mind, this morning was her ultimate validation. She had successfully stolen a wealthy executive, secured a luxury penthouse, and was now standing on the very precipice of high society. Just steps behind them, the rest of the arrogant royal family made their grand entrance. Richard and Brenda strutted into the opulent lobby, practically glowing with extreme, unjustified parental pride. Brenda wore a heavy diamond necklace that caught the harsh light of the media flashes. She nodded condescendingly to the junior partners, acting as if she personally owned the entire skyscraper. Rachel walked closely beside her parents, adjusting her expensive silk scarf, eager to bathe in the secondary glory of her brother's corporate victory. They had spent the last 2 days aggressively complaining about Terrence and his sudden betrayal, but this morning they pushed all of that aside. They were here to witness Preston become a billionaire-level player, thoroughly convinced that their family bloodline was inherently superior to everyone else in the city. The loud crowd parted respectfully as the chairman of the venture capital fund slowly descended the sweeping glass staircase. He was a ruthless billionaire who commanded the absolute fear and total respect of every single person in the building. The entire lobby instantly fell silent as he raised his hand to address the gathered media and the eager executives. "Good morning, everyone," the chairman announced, his booming voice echoing perfectly off the polished marble walls. "Today marks a historic paradigm shift for our firm. We are officially executing the final contracts to fully acquire Aegis Shield, the absolute pinnacle of global cybersecurity. As you all know, the brilliant architect behind this phenomenal corporation has maintained a legendary level of total anonymity throughout their entire career. However, today is a day of unprecedented transparency. I have just been informed by their executive security team that the elusive founder of Aegis Shield has finally agreed to step out of the shadows. They are here right now in this very building, and they are preparing to reveal their true identity to the world for the very first time." A loud, frantic murmur of sheer excitement ripped through the crowded pool of journalists. Camera shutters clicked wildly in a deafening chorus. Preston stood near the front of the crowd, his arrogant smile widening even further. He puffed out his chest, completely ready to shake hands with the anonymous genius he firmly believed he had successfully negotiated into submission. He envisioned the glossy photographs of himself standing shoulder to shoulder with a tech legend, prestigious images that would definitely run on the front page of every major financial publication by noon. "I invite our executive board, the press pool, and our lead negotiator to step inside the grand glass boardroom," the chairman instructed, gesturing broadly toward the massive transparent conference space located at the far end of the lobby. "It is time to meet the visionary who built this empire." Preston quickly adjusted his silk tie, gave Lexi a supremely confident wink, and proudly led his parents and sister toward the VIP enclosure. The grand glass boardroom was an absolute architectural masterpiece, completely transparent on all sides, but heavily soundproofed to protect classified conversations. A massive, highly polished mahogany table dominated the exact center of the room. The chairman took his position at the very head of the table. Preston confidently took the seat directly to his right, the designated spot of honor for the conquering hero. Lexi, Richard, Brenda, and Rachel stood proudly directly behind him, forming a solid, impenetrable wall of arrogant family support. The press pool crowded aggressively against the glass walls outside, their heavy camera lenses pressed eagerly against the transparent barriers, waiting to capture the historic reveal. The atmosphere inside the room was thick with electrifying, overwhelming anticipation. Preston leaned back in his leather chair, practically vibrating with raw excitement. He looked around the pristine, quiet room, mentally calculating the massive 8-figure bonus that was supposedly just minutes away from hitting his frozen bank account. He felt completely, undeniably untouchable. He felt like an absolute god among men. Then the heavy, frosted double doors at the far end of the long boardroom began to slowly, dramatically swing open. The low hum of excited whispers instantly died completely, replaced by a suffocating, absolute silence. Every single eye in the vast room locked securely onto the dark, shadowy entrance. The entire venture capital firm held its collective breath in pure anticipation. From the deep shadows of the corridor, a crisp, terrifyingly rhythmic sound sliced through the dead quiet of the room. It was the sharp, cold, distinct click of a stiletto heel striking the polished marble floor. Then another click, and another. The steady, methodical sound echoed off the glass walls like the relentless ticking of a lethal, inescapable clock. The rhythmic clicking grew louder, echoing against the thick glass walls. The heavy frosted doors swung open, pushed wide by two men wearing dark tactical suits. The bright lobby lights spilled into the room, casting a commanding shadow across the mahogany table. I stepped inside. I did not look like the quiet forensic accountant they discarded at a restaurant. I wore a tailored midnight black Armani power suit, radiating sheer authority. My hair was pulled back into a severe style, commanding the attention of every breathing soul. Walking behind my right shoulder was Terrence. He wore his chief legal officer badge proudly on his lapel, his expression carved from solid granite. 4 corporate security contractors flanked us, forming an impenetrable shield. We moved with the synchronized grace of an apex predator. The camera flashes from the press pool outside multiplied. Preston sat frozen in his chair of honor, his brain violently short-circuited as he processed the visual information. For a split second, sheer confusion washed over his arrogant features. Then his fragile ego overrode his logic. He genuinely believed I lost my mind. He thought I hired actors to stage a disruption to ruin his life. His face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. He slammed both hands down onto the mahogany table, the smack echoing through the quiet room. He sprang to his feet, knocking his leather chair backward. Security Preston roared, his voice cracking with unhinged fury. "Guard, get in here right now. Who allowed this woman past the front desk?" He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. He looked frantically toward the glass doors, expecting security to tackle me. "This is an absolute outrage," Preston yelled, spit flying from his lips. "This is my mentally unstable ex-wife. She has been aggressively stalking me since our divorce began. She is an unhinged, unemployed accountant, desperately trying to ruin my reputation. Someone drag this lunatic out before she ruins this historic signing ceremony." Behind him, his family joined the chaotic chorus of elite indignation. Brenda let out a loud gasp, clutching her diamond necklace. She glared at me with pure, unfiltered hatred. "I told you she was a psychotic gold digger," Brenda hissed loudly to the other executives. "She is completely obsessed with my son. Have her arrested for trespassing immediately." Richard crossed his arms, shaking his head in disgust, while Rachel glared furiously at Terrence. Rachel could not comprehend why her husband was standing shoulder to shoulder with the enemy, actively participating in what she assumed was a massive public stunt. Lexi stood right behind Preston, clutching her bright orange Hermes bag. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh, looking at me like a pathetic peasant. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to argue. I did not even look at Preston or his enraged, shouting family members. I simply stood at the end of the long mahogany table, perfectly calm, waiting for the inevitable, catastrophic shift in reality. The chairman of the venture capital fund, the ruthless billionaire who controlled Preston's entire corporate existence, had been sitting completely still at the head of the table. He had not joined in the shouting. He had been staring at the encrypted identification badge pinned to my lapel. The chairman suddenly stood up. The commanding presence of the older billionaire instantly silenced the entire room. Preston snapped his mouth shut, expecting his supreme boss to personally order my immediate destruction. Preston adjusted his suit jacket, puffing his chest out, ready to watch the chairman obliterate me. Instead, the chairman buttoned his suit jacket, stepped away from his chair, and walked down the length of the mahogany table. He stopped directly in front of me. The room watched in paralyzing disbelief as the most powerful man in the financial district bowed his head. "Welcome to Chicago, Madam Chairman," he said, his booming voice carrying undeniable, profound respect. "It is an absolute honor to finally meet the founder and chairman of Aegis Shield, Ms. Stella." The room died. The silence that instantly crashed down upon the grand boardroom was not just quiet. It was a suffocating physical weight. It was the sound of a massive, impenetrable illusion violently shattering into a million jagged pieces. The air was entirely sucked out. Preston stopped breathing. The blood completely drained from his face in a single terrifying second. His arrogant expression melted into pure, unadulterated horror. His eyes bugged out of his head, darting wildly between his supreme boss and the woman he treated like garbage for 5 long years. Behind him, the devastating shockwave hit his family with the force of a freight train. Brenda's jaw literally dropped open, her eyes wide with total paralyzing terror. Richard staggered backward, grabbing the edge of a chair to stop his knees from entirely buckling. Rachel stared at Terrence, finally realizing that her brilliant husband was not participating in a stunt. He was standing as the chief legal officer of a billion-dollar empire. Lexi stood completely frozen. The smug, mocking smile was permanently wiped off her glossy lips. Her hands went entirely numb as her brain failed to process the mathematical impossibility of the situation. The bright orange Hermes bag slipped through her manicured fingers. It hit the polished marble floor with a heavy, hollow thud that echoed like a gunshot in the dead silent room. I kept my eyes locked completely on Preston. I watched the realization violently tear through his mind. He was not acquiring a company today. He was surrendering his existence to the woman he tried destroying. The man who thought he controlled the entire universe could not even control his own vocal cords. Preston took a weak, stumbling step backward. His hands shook violently at his sides. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, desperately trying to form a single coherent word. "No." Preston stammered, his voice reduced to a pathetic, broken whisper. "No. It is completely impossible." I did not smile or offer polite pleasantries to the powerful executives standing completely frozen around the massive mahogany table. I simply walked past my terrified ex-husband, the sharp rhythm of my heels echoing in the silence, and took my place at the head of the boardroom table. The chairman of the venture capital fund remained standing out of sheer respect, gesturing for the rest of his elite board members to take their seats. They moved like absolute ghosts, entirely mesmerized by the catastrophic shift in power. Preston remained standing, swaying slightly in his expensive leather shoes. His mouth hung open, but his vocal cords were paralyzed. Lexi was practically hyperventilating next to her dropped designer bag, while Richard and Brenda stared at me as if I had just grown wings and breathed fire. I placed my hands flat against the polished wood of the table. I looked directly at the chairman, my voice echoing with absolute, unwavering authority. "I did not come here today to sign the contract," I stated, my tone dropping the temperature in the room to absolute zero. "I came to cancel it." A collective horrified gasp rippled through the assembled executives. The press pool outside the glass walls shoved their camera lenses harder against the transparent barriers, sensing an explosive corporate disaster unfolding in real time. The chairman swallowed hard, his professional composure cracking. "Madam Chairman," he began, his voice laced with sudden panic. "If there is an issue with the valuation, our firm is willing to renegotiate every term. We have dedicated $400 million to this acquisition." "The issue is not your capital," I replied coldly, leaning back in my heavy leather chair. "The issue is your catastrophic lack of internal compliance. Terrence, if you would please illuminate the entire board." Terrence stepped forward, his presence radiating the lethal confidence of a chief legal officer executing a flawless corporate assassination. He pulled a small black remote from his tailored suit jacket and pointed it directly at the ceiling. The massive high-definition projector screens lowered silently behind me, instantly dominating the entire boardroom. Terrence pressed a single button. The screens flared to life with blindingly bright, incredibly detailed financial forensics. He did not just show spreadsheets, he displayed a completely undeniable, devastatingly clear map of his massive federal crimes. "What you are currently looking at," Terrence announced, his deep voice projecting absolute doom, "is the systematic, aggressive embezzlement of exactly $400,000 directly from the Union Workers' Retirement Fund. These specific funds were discreetly siphoned by your lead negotiator, Preston, over the last 8 months." The boardroom erupted into total chaos. Board members shouted in pure disbelief, aggressively pointing at the glowing screens. Preston stumbled backward, crashing heavily into a leather chair. He clutched his chest, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as his entire life evaporated right before his eyes. Terrence pressed the button again. The screen instantly shifted to display the wire transfer receipts, the fraudulent Delaware Shell Corporation registrations, and the heavily documented luxury purchases. Preston actively diverted these stolen pension funds to purchase a Gold Coast penthouse and a Porsche Carrera. Terrence continued relentlessly slicing through the frantic noise. Both of these exorbitant luxury assets were purchased exclusively for his 24-year-old subordinate employee, who is currently standing right there. Every single executive head snapped around to glare furiously at Lexi. She let out a pathetic whimper, desperately trying to shrink backward into the pristine glass wall. Brenda clutched Richard's arm, her knees physically buckling as the horrifying reality of her son's massive criminal exposure hit her like a physical blow. But the absolute worst was yet to come. Terrence pressed the button a third and final time. Furthermore, Terrence boomed, dominating the completely panicked room entirely. When Preston realized his personal assets were legally frozen during his contested divorce proceedings, he committed corporate identity theft. He falsely utilized this specific firm's official credentials to secure a highly illegal $2 million bridge loan from a violent underground equity syndicate. The digital image of the shadow loan contract flashed across the massive screens. Lexi's signature glowed brightly on the primary guarantor line right next to the forged corporate seal Preston had applied. The chairman turned to look at Preston. The older billionaire's face contorted into a mask of pure rage. The realization that his prestigious firm was directly implicated in federal pension theft and unregulated syndicate loans completely shattered his professional restraint. I stood up slowly from my chair, ensuring every camera lens in the hallway captured my expression. I looked directly into the furious eyes of the chairman. Aegis Shield refuses to partner with an investment fund that cannot even control its own director from embezzling trusting clients' retirement funds just to keep a mistress, I declared, driving the final nail into Preston's coffin. We are severing all ties. Your firm is compromised. The chairman did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. His entire corporate empire was actively burning, and he needed to instantly sever the infected limb. He turned his blazing, furious eyes directly onto his former golden boy. "Preston, you are fired!" The chairman roared, his voice shaking the heavy glass walls of the boardroom. "You are stripped of all titles, all equity, and all access. You are a complete disgrace to this institution. Security, confiscate his corporate badge and his company devices immediately." Preston dropped to his knees right there on the polished marble floor. He buried his face in his trembling hands, sobbing openly and hysterically in front of the entire executive board. The flashing cameras captured everything. The absolute silence of total devastation washed over the room. But then a new sound pierced through the heavy glass walls. It started as a faint, distant wail, echoing through the concrete canyons. The sound rapidly grew louder and undeniably urgent. It was the sharp, piercing shriek of police sirens screeching to a sudden halt outside. The wail of the sirens outside amplified, echoing off the concrete canyons of the financial district and piercing straight through the thick glass walls of the executive boardroom. The flashing red and blue lights painted the faces of the terrified executives in harsh, chaotic strokes. Down in the main lobby, the pristine atmosphere of the corporate signing ceremony instantly dissolved into absolute bedlam. The heavy revolving doors were shoved violently open, not by wealthy investors or eager journalists, but by a swarm of federal agents wearing dark tactical windbreakers with large yellow letters spelling out FBI and SEC across their broad backs. The press pools scrambled frantically out of the way, their camera flashes firing in a blinding, relentless frenzy. They knew they were capturing the absolute downfall of a financial empire. The federal agents marched in a tight, highly disciplined formation, their heavy boots slamming against the polished marble floor. They moved with terrifying, undeniable purpose, cutting straight through the opulent lobby and heading directly for the transparent walls of our VIP enclosure. Preston remained frozen on the floor, his knees pressed against the cold stone, his tear-streaked face staring blankly at the approaching tactical team. The heavy frosted glass doors of the boardroom were yanked open with brutal, unforgiving force. A stern, broad-shouldered federal agent stepped into the room holding up a golden badge and a thick stack of legal warrants. Preston, the lead agent, announced, his deep voice projecting absolute, inescapable doom over the dead silent room. You are under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, aggravated corporate identity theft, and the systematic embezzlement of union pension funds. Stand up and place your hands behind your back immediately. Preston did not move. His brain had completely shut down. The sheer, staggering weight of his spectacular failure had physically paralyzed his limbs. Two federal agents stepped forward, grabbing him by the shoulders of his incredibly expensive custom-tailored suit. They hauled him to his feet without a single ounce of gentleness. The sharp, terrifying click of heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around his wrists echoed through the tense boardroom. Preston sobbed openly, his chest heaving with violent, pathetic gasps. He looked around the room with wild, desperate eyes, silently begging the billionaire chairman to save him from this nightmare. The chairman simply turned his back in total, unspoken disgust. Preston looked at his elite finance buddies pressing their faces against the glass walls outside, but they were already stepping backward aggressively, distancing themselves from a radioactive criminal. He had absolutely nobody left to manipulate. Lexi stood frozen a few feet away, her heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her ribs. She stared at the federal agents, her eyes darting between the steel handcuffs and Preston's weeping face. The intoxicating illusion of her billionaire lifestyle was actively burning to the ground, right in front of her. But the absolute worst realization was just beginning to claw its way into her superficial mind. She looked up at the massive projection screens, still glowing brightly above the mahogany table. The digital image of the unregulated shadow loan contract was still displayed in high definition. She saw her own signature glowing on the primary guarantor line. She saw the $2 million principal amount. And then the horrifying, brutal reality crashed down onto her shoulders with the force of a falling skyscraper. Preston was going to federal prison for decades. He had absolutely zero access to his frozen bank accounts. The Aegis Shield acquisition bonus, the massive payout he promised would erase the syndicate debt, was completely dead. That meant the violent underground loan sharks were not going to hunt down a federally incarcerated venture capitalist. They were going to hunt down the primary guarantor. They were going to hunt down her. Lexi let out a shrill, piercing scream of pure, unadulterated panic. She lunged forward, grabbing Preston by the lapels of his ruined suit. "You lied to me!" Lexi shrieked, her voice cracking with violent hysteria. "You told me that money was a corporate advance. You made me sign for a shadow loan. You ruined my entire life, you pathetic, miserable fraud." She ripped the massive, expensive diamond engagement ring off her finger. She hurled the heavy jewel directly at his face. The diamond struck his cheekbone with a sharp thud and bounced away across the marble floor. "I am not going to prison for you," Lexi screamed, spinning around on her high heels. She abandoned her bright orange designer handbag on the floor and bolted directly toward the open glass doors, desperately trying to escape the federal slaughterhouse. She did not make it 3 steps. A female federal agent instantly stepped into her path, blocking the exit with a solid, unyielding stance. The agent grabbed Lexi by the wrist, twisting her arm firmly behind her back in one swift, highly practiced motion. "You are not going anywhere," the agent stated coldly, pulling a second pair of steel handcuffs from her tactical belt. "You are officially under arrest as a primary accomplice to corporate financial fraud. You have the right to remain silent, and I highly suggest you start using it." Lexi kicked and thrashed, wailing hysterically, as the cold steel clamped down tightly around her wrists. The press pool outside went absolutely wild, their camera shutters capturing every single second of the Mistress being hauled away in disgrace. The majestic, untouchable kingdom Preston had tried to build was completely eradicated. The federal agents began physically marching the weeping, broken venture capitalist and his screaming accomplice out of the glass boardroom, parading them directly through the crowded lobby of the firm he thought he ruled. As the chaotic, heavily documented arrest unfolded, the crushing reality of the situation finally hit the remaining members of the arrogant royal family. Richard and Brenda stood entirely paralyzed, their faces drained of all color, their elite high society reputation permanently incinerated. They watched their golden child, the son they claimed was vastly superior to everyone else, being dragged away to a federal penitentiary in complete and utter disgrace. The profound arrogance that had fueled their entire existence evaporated in a single devastating instant. They were no longer the proud, condescending aristocrats looking down their noses at a foster care orphan. They were the humiliated parents of a highly publicized corporate felon. The social destruction they feared more than death itself had officially arrived. Brenda let out a ragged, choking sob. Her knees physically gave out beneath her. She collapsed onto the polished marble floor, her expensive fur coat pooling around her trembling legs. Richard staggered forward, his eyes wild with sheer, blinding panic. All of their toxic pride completely shattered, leaving behind nothing but raw, pathetic desperation. They scrambled across the floor, their hands reaching out frantically. They crawled directly toward the head of the mahogany table, positioning themselves right at my feet. Richard and Brenda, the very same people who had mocked my background and cheered for my destruction at an anniversary dinner, dropped entirely to their knees. They looked up at me with tear-streaked, horrified faces, their hands clasped together in pure, unadulterated begging. Richard and Brenda remained anchored to the polished marble floor, the humiliation of groveling at my feet no longer mattering to them. They only cared that their golden child was being processed for federal prison. Brenda reached out with trembling, manicured fingers, desperately grabbing the hem of my tailored Armani trousers. Tears streamed down her powdered cheeks, ruining her pristine makeup and leaving ugly streaks. "Stella, please," Brenda sobbed, her voice cracking into a high, pathetic wail. "You have to stop this. You have the power to call off the federal agents. Tell them it was a massive misunderstanding. Tell them Lexi manipulated him into taking that money. He is your husband. You cannot send him to a federal penitentiary. He will not survive in there. We will give you the suburban mansion. We will give you anything you want. Just drop the criminal charges." I looked down at the woman who had spent 5 years treating me like absolute garbage. I did not step back. I did not kick her hand away. I simply stared at her with eyes cold as a frozen glacier. "I am not the one pressing charges, Brenda," I stated, my voice echoing with terrifying absolute calm. "The Securities and Exchange Commission is pressing charges. The federal government does not negotiate with angry mothers. Your son stole the retirement funds of hard-working union workers to buy sports cars for a 24-year-old girl. He forged corporate documents to secure illegal syndicate loans. I did not force him to commit those massive felonies. I simply turned on the lights so everyone could see the cockroaches scattering." Richard let out a desperate, choking gasp. He realized my absolute lack of mercy. He frantically turned his bloodshot eyes away from me and looked directly at the man standing tall by my side. Richard scrambled across the marble floor, positioning himself at the feet of his son-in-law. "Terrence, you have to do something," Richard pleaded, his voice shaking with raw, unadulterated panic. "You are a brilliant corporate litigator. You know the federal judges in this district. You are married to my daughter. We are family. You have to step in and save your brother. Please, Terrence. Represent him. Use your influence to negotiate a plea deal. We will pay you whatever you want. Name your price." Terrence looked down at the pathetic, weeping older man. The sheer hypocrisy of the request hung heavily in the suffocating air of the boardroom. For 8 long years, Richard and Brenda had actively excluded Terrence from their elite social circles. They had mocked his background, dismissed his hard-earned legal achievements, and treated him like a convenient diversity token rather than a legitimate member of their wealthy family. Now, staring into the abyss of total financial destruction, they were begging the very black man they had constantly disrespected to miraculously save their golden boy. Terence did not flinch. He did not show a single ounce of sympathy. He slowly reached up his large hands, grasping the edges of his bespoke midnight blue suit jacket. He methodically fastened the center button, projecting the undeniable commanding authority of a supreme corporate executioner. "Your family never considered me one of your own," Richard Terence stated, his deep voice slicing through the frantic noise like a razor blade. "You only invoke the word family when you need someone to clean up your spectacular messes. Today I am not your son-in-law. Today I am here strictly in my official capacity as the Chief Legal Officer for billionaire Stella. My only professional obligation is to protect Aegis Shield from toxic criminal elements like your son. You are entirely on your own." Richard physically recoiled, as if Terence had struck him across the face. He collapsed onto the floor next to his weeping wife, burying his face in his trembling hands. The invincible, untouchable family dynasty was officially dead buried under the crushing weight of their own supreme arrogance. At that exact moment, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open wider. Two broad-shouldered federal agents firmly marched Preston back into the room. His hands were securely locked behind his back in heavy steel handcuffs. The agents were guiding him directly toward the main lobby to face the massive, aggressive press pool waiting outside. His path took him right past the head of the mahogany table where I was standing. Preston looked completely shattered. His custom suit was wrinkled and disheveled. His face was a pale, sickly shade of gray. His eyes were wide, hollow, and utterly devoid of the smug, narcissistic pride he had carried into the building just 30 minutes ago. He slowed his pace as he approached my position, staring at me with a pathetic, broken expression. He wanted to say something, but his vocal cords were completely paralyzed by absolute terror. I reached down to the polished wooden table. I wrapped my fingers around a crystal glass filled with ice-cold water. I lifted the heavy glass into the air, holding it directly at eye level. I looked straight into the hollow, defeated eyes of the man who had publicly humiliated me at our anniversary dinner. A slow, genuinely bright smile spread across my face. "Remember your magnificent toast at our 5-year anniversary dinner, Preston?" I asked, my voice ringing with crystal-clear, lethal satisfaction. "Let me return the favor right here and now, a toast to your brand-new prison uniform." Preston let out a sharp, agonizing whimper. The federal agents did not allow him to linger. They gripped his shoulders firmly and marched him out of the glass boardroom, parading the disgraced, weeping venture capitalist directly into the blinding barrage of camera flashes and screaming journalists in the main lobby. I gently placed the crystal glass back onto the mahogany coaster. The execution was completely flawless. Every single loose end was securely tied. I turned to Terence and gave him a brief, respectful nod. It was time to leave. We walked out of the glass boardroom, leaving Richard and Brenda sobbing hysterically on the floor. We stepped into the chaotic, overcrowded lobby. The sea of aggressive financial reporters and industry journalists instantly parted for us, recognizing the undeniable supreme authority radiating from our presence. The camera shutters fired relentlessly, capturing the striking image of the anonymous founder of Aegis Shield, finally emerging from the shadows. I kept my head high, my posture perfectly rigid, ignoring the desperate questions shouted from the press pool. We pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors and stepped out into the freezing bright Chicago morning. The crisp air felt incredibly clean. A sleek midnight black Rolls-Royce was already parked illegally at the curb, the engine purring softly. A highly trained security contractor immediately opened the heavy rear door for me. I stepped into the luxurious, quiet interior of the vehicle, taking my seat on the plush leather. Terence slid into the seat across from me, his briefcase resting securely on his lap. The heavy door slammed shut, instantly severing the chaotic noise of the financial district. The driver smoothly pulled the massive vehicle away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the busy downtown traffic. I looked out the tinted window one last time. Behind me, the towering glass skyscraper stood as a monument to a brutal, logical, and entirely justified collapse. The arrogant people who tried to destroy my life were currently burning in the spectacular fire they had started themselves. I leaned back against the premium leather, closing my eyes as the screen of my past finally faded to black. The most profound lesson we can draw from this story is that true power never needs to be loud, arrogant, or aggressively paraded for the world to see. For years, the toxic individuals in this narrative genuinely believed that their superficial wealth, elite social status, and relentless cruelty made them completely untouchable. They tragically confused cruelty with strength and blind arrogance with absolute security. Meanwhile, the woman they constantly underestimated, mocked, and humiliated did not waste her precious energy screaming, throwing emotional tantrums, or begging for their fleeting validation. Instead, she chose the path of absolute calculated resilience. She built a massive, undeniable empire in complete silence, patiently letting her abusers blindly construct the very trapdoor of their own spectacular downfall. This narrative teaches us a universal, undeniable truth about navigating toxic relationships and narcissistic abuse. You never actually have to destroy people who are fundamentally corrupt. If you establish ironclad boundaries, protect your own assets, and simply let the unvarnished truth surface, toxic people will ultimately destroy themselves. The husband's insatiable greed and severely inflated ego led directly to his federal imprisonment, while his family's elitist pride instantly crumbled into pure public disgrace. They lost absolutely everything because they built their entire existence on a fragile foundation of lies, manipulation, and blatant exploitation. When you are surrounded by people who constantly belittle your worth, your greatest revenge is never lowering yourself to their chaotic level. Your ultimate revenge is outgrowing their toxic ecosystem entirely. It is focusing relentlessly on your own personal growth, maintaining your unwavering integrity, and walking away with your head held high. You do not owe your loyalty to a partner or a family who treats you like an insignificant stepping stone. You owe loyalty only to yourself, your truth, and the magnificent future you are fiercely building. Have you ever had to silently rebuild your life after being profoundly underestimated by the people closest to you? Share your own story of triumphant resilience in the comments below, and do not forget to hit that subscribe button for more empowering content.